The city breathes in a low gray rhythm, a mechanical pulse of concrete and caffeine that hums before the first pale light of dawn cuts through the smog. In millions of rooms across the waking world, eyes snap open to the dark ceiling, not with the gentle awakening of a restored spirit, but with the immediate, cold grip of a logistical ledger. There is a silent panic that arrives before the feet even touch the floor. It is the sudden remembering of unfinished wars, of emails waiting like tripwires, of quotas, debts, and invisible scorecards that must be tended to. To the casual observer, this is merely the standard theater of ambition. Society calls it the price of admission, the inevitable friction of a life built with consequence. But look closer. Peer beneath the manicured veneer of productivity, past the polished LinkedIn testimonials and the synchronized strides of morning commuters clutching their porcelain cups. Listen to the quiet spaces between the frantic typing and the hurried exchanges. What sounds like drive is actually something entirely different. It is the frantic clatter of a soul trying to outrun its own eviction. There is a profound paradox hidden in the modern architecture of striving. The harder man pushes against the world, the more fiercely the world locks its doors against him. Yet, more haunting still is the quiet tragedy of the man who breaks his knuckles pushing against a door that was never locked to begin with. Consider the anatomy of this weariness. There is a sacred, holy fatigue that follows a day of true creation, the sweet, aching depletion of muscles that have hauled stone for a cathedral, or fingers that have coaxed a melody from silent strings. That tiredness sleeps soundly. It curls up at the foot of the bed like a faithful hound and restores the vessel by morning. Soul exhaustion is of an entirely different lineage. It is a bone-deep, marrow-bleeding corrosion. It is the distinct, heavy numbness of a soldier who has spent decades defending a border in a war that was never declared, against an enemy that never existed. It is the frantic desperation of an architect who spends his entire life engineering elaborate, Rube Goldberg-esque contraptions to force water to flow uphill, convinced that if he only adds one more pulley, one more gear, one more strategic calculation, the laws of nature will finally bend to his ego. He checks his devices. He scans the horizon for threats. He calculates the angles of his social currency. And all the while he is pushing against a door that stands wide open, held shut only by the sheer, stubborn pressure of his own frantic palms. Stop. Just for this fleeting moment, suspended in the amber of the present, let the hands drop from the invisible machinery. Let the breath settle into the quiet chambers of the chest. The battle you are fighting today, was it ever truly yours to command, or did you simply inherit the armor from a world that forgot how to rest? To dismantle soul exhaustion, one must venture past the symptoms of burnout and interrogate the underlying philosophy of the striving ego. Why does modern consciousness default so reliably to a state of desperate, white-knuckled engineering? Why does the human mind look upon the vast, self-sustaining tapestry of reality and immediately conclude, if I do not hold every thread, the entire cosmos will unravel? To answer this, we must employ recursive thinking. We must ask why the ego strategizes, and then ask why, behind that answer, descending deeper into the psychological bedrock until the foundational illusion is exposed. First layer, why does man constantly strategize? Because he believes that safety and provision are scarce resources locked behind closed doors, and that access to them must be won through tactical superiority, relentless persuasion, and the subdual of external circumstances. He assumes the universe is a passive, inert field of resistance that requires a crowbar to yield its treasures. Second layer, why does he believe the universe is an inert field of resistance? Because he has identified exclusively with his surface-level, physical identity the isolated ego trapped inside a bag of skin, cast adrift in a mechanical cosmos. From this fragmented vantage point, he perceives a separation between himself and what he desires. He sees the goal over there, and himself over here, separated by a vast, hostile chasm of time, chance, and competition. Third layer, why does this identification create soul exhaustion? Because the moment consciousness accepts separation as its operating system, it inherits the exhausting burden of the bridge builder. If you are separate from your good, then you must cross the chasm manually. You must engineer the vehicle, pave the road, fight off the bandits of bad timing, and force the outcome into existence through raw, unyielding willpower. This is the psychological genesis of the striving architect. The striving architect operates on a deeply flawed metaphysical equation: effort equals causation. He believes that the sweat on his brow is what actually brings the harvest into being. If a project succeeds, he attributes it to the brilliance of his strategy and the ferocity of his labor. If a project fails, he instantly concludes that his effort was quantitatively insufficient, he did not work hard enough, did not network widely enough, did not outthink the variables cleverly enough. This creates a terrifying psychological trap. It binds the human worth and the universal outcome entirely to the fragile, finite capacity of the conscious mind. When the mind encounters obstacles, as it inevitably must in a world of shifting forms, it does not pause to question its foundational premise. Instead, it doubles down. It revs the engine while the transmission is locked in park. It generates layers upon layers of secondary strategies, masking anxiety as diligence and panic as tactical preparation. How does this manifest in daily reality? It manifests as the chronic inability to sit in stillness without guilt. It manifests as the compulsive checking of metrics, the restless scanning of rooms for leverage, and the low-grade hum of dread that whispers, "If I stop pushing for even a second, everything I have built will dissolve into dust." Yet, psychological depth reveals a startling inversion. The exhaustion you feel is not a sign that you are failing at the game of life. It is the deep, intelligent rebellion of your own soul against the game itself. Your exhaustion is your inner nature staging a sit-down strike. Consciousness is attempting to signal to your frantic ego that you are burning down the house to keep warm. You are expending the infinite creative energy of the cosmos to push a feather across a tabletop, convinced you are moving a mountain. When you look closely at the mechanics of striving, you realize that the suffering is entirely self-generated by the confusion of roles, the small, anxious mental construct trying desperately to play the part of an omnipotent creator, while ignoring the infinite, silent intelligence that has been running the stars long before the ego learned how to worry. In the twilight years of the 19th century, along the jagged, mist-shrouded banks of the upper Columbia River, there lived a legendary riverman named Kalen. For over 40 years, Kalen had earned a fearsome reputation as the fiercest navigator of the Whitewater Rapids. While other men feared the roaring obsidian gorges where the current surged with the fury of a thawing continent, Kalen embraced them as his personal proving ground. His philosophy was simple, brutal, and entirely orthodox. Mastery is a measure of muscle. Every morning, before the mountain mist had cleared, Kalen could be seen wading into the freezing, churning current, his heavily scarred arms gripping his ashwood oars. He did not drift. He did not yield. Every mile gained was a violent negotiation with the water. If the current pushed east, Kalen threw his weight west, gritting his teeth until the veins in his neck stood out like corded hemp. He studied the eddies not to find a passage, but to calculate how to conquer them. He spent his days fighting the river, calculating angles of resistance, cursing the hidden rocks, and rowing with a relentless, punishing cadence that left his hands permanently calloused and his joints screaming with chronic arthritis. The river is an adversary, Kalen would tell the young men who gathered on the shore to watch his legendary displays of endurance. It wants to smash you against the cliffs. It wants to drag you to the abyss. You must break its will before it breaks yours. Never stop pulling, never let go of the oars. For decades, his strategy worked, measured by the sheer volume of sweat and the number of miles forced behind him. But as the winters mounted and the decades wore on into his late 60s, a terrible transformation occurred. The river had not aged a day. It remained as vast, cold, and effortlessly powerful as it was when the world was young. But Kalen was breaking. His shoulders grew hollow. His chest caved inward from the endless strain, and a profound, hollow weariness settled into his eyes. He found himself waking in the middle of the night with his fists clenched so tightly his palms bled, dreaming of the deafening roar of white water even when he lay safe in his cabin miles from the shore. One autumn evening, battered by a grueling 11-hour push against an unyielding flood, Kalen collapsed on the rocky bank. His heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. His lungs burned as though he had been breathing smoke. He looked out across the vast, dark expanse of the water, and for the first time in his life, a devastating clarity pierced through the armor of his pride. The river was not an enemy. It had never been an enemy. The immense, terrifying current that had broken his body was the very same current that originated from the pristine mountain springs miles above and flowed inevitably toward the vast, open bounty of the southern sea. The water was not trying to drown him. It was carrying a freight of life, abundance, and momentum. It was he, the great master navigator, who had spent 40 years fighting the delivery system of the universe, exhausting his life force to swim upstream in a river that led everywhere he claimed he wanted to go. As he lay there in the damp moss, too exhausted to lift an oar, a strange impulse rose within him. Instead of fighting to drag his heavy wooden boat back into the current against the flow, Kalen untied the mooring rope, pushed off from the bank, and simply lay back in the hull. He let go of the oars. He let them drift away into the dark water. For a terrifying heartbeat, he felt the sickening sensation of surrender, the ego screaming that to stop rowing was to perish. But then, the current caught the boat. There was no crash. There was no desperate struggle. Instead of the grinding friction of ash against resistance, there was a sudden, breathtaking silence. The boat lifted effortlessly on the swells. The dark banks began to slide past him, not with the agonizing crawl of his labored rowing, but with the smooth, silent velocity of a falling star. The river did not require his muscle. It required his permission. Kalen closed his eyes, and for the first time in 40 years, he felt the deep, profound relief of a man who had finally put down a weight he never needed to carry. He was no longer the exhausted architect forcing the water to move. He was the grateful passenger being carried home by an intelligence infinitely grander than his own. The story of the rivermen is not an ancient campfire fable. It is the precise psychological mirror of your own daily existence. You have spent your life standing in the roaring rapids of your career, your relationships, and your ambitions, gripping your oars with white-knuckled desperation. You have equated the strain in your muscles with the validity of your purpose, convinced that if you are not suffering, you are not succeeding. You have treated every natural delay as an personal insult, and every open door as a fortress you had to breach through sheer tactical force. It is time to drop the oars. This does not mean descending into apathy or surrendering your highest aspirations. True surrender is not the resignation of the defeated, it is the supreme intelligence of the master. It is the realization that striving is an obsolete technology, a primitive, brute force method utilized by an ego that has forgotten its connection to the infinite source of all manifestation. Take a slow, deep breath, feel the solid earth beneath you. Recognize that the exhaustion you carry is nothing more than the residual weight of your own interference. You are not required to build the bridge, engineer the timeline, or force the universe to recognize your worth. The very desire that burns in your chest, the life you long to live, the peace you yearn to inhabit, is not an impossible mountain waiting to be scaled. It is the destination toward which the river of your own consciousness is already flowing. If you stop fighting the current today, what would happen? The world would not collapse. Your life would not disintegrate into chaos. Instead, something far more radical would occur. The friction would cease. You are standing at the edge of an entirely new paradigm of existence. In the chapters that lie ahead, we will dismantle the illusion of lack, decode the sacred geometry of inspired action, and reveal the exact mechanics of how consciousness shapes reality without a single drop of sweat. But before we can cross that bridge, you must make a silent, irrevocable pact with yourself tonight. You must release the oars. Turn your gaze away from the frantic architecture of your strategies and look toward the quiet, luminous horizon. The river is waiting. And as you prepare to step into the next revelation of your journey, ask yourself this final haunting question. What if everything you have been struggling to force into your life is already waiting downstream, simply waiting for you to stop swimming against the tide? Midnight settles over the ancient city like a velvet pall, silencing the hurried clatter of commerce and the hollow echoes of daytime anxieties. In a solitary room high above the sleeping streets, a lone seeker sits in profound stillness. The world outside is frozen in pitch-black shadow, devoid of movement, devoid of promise. Yet, within the quiet sanctuary of the inner mind, a sudden breathtaking illumination flares into being. It arrives unannounced, unsummoned by the conscious intellect. It is not a logical deduction, nor is it a calculated projection of past experience. It flashes across the inner landscape like a streak of summer lightning across a starlit vault, an unbidden vision of a life transfigured. It is a profound, luminous longing, a relationship steeped in mutual reverence, a physical healing that restores vitality to a weary frame, a creative work waiting to spill onto virgin paper, or a state of abundance that breathes freedom into every waking hour. To the superficial eye, it is merely a thought, a fleeting neurological spark firing in the dark. But to the observer attuned to the deeper cadence of existence, it is something entirely sacred. There is a profound paradox hidden in the emergence of human longing. The very desire that torments the heart with a sense of its current absence is, in truth, the universe whispering an immutable guarantee of its future presence. Consider the anatomy of this phenomenon. Most men look upon their deepest, most luminous desires with immediate suspicion. They treat their longings like uninvited guests at a royal banquet, cross-examining them with cold skepticism. Who are you to want this? Where is your proof? How do you expect to survive the brutal realities of the world? They crush the spark beneath the heavy boot of practicality, convincing themselves that to dream beyond their present circumstance is a dangerous form of madness. Look closer at the nature of the seed beneath the winter frost. Does the acorn lie in the frozen earth and negotiate with the soil, questioning whether it has the worthiness or the administrative strategy to become an oak? Does it draft blueprints for its own branches? No. The acorn holds within its silent core the absolute, unalterable blueprint of the canopy. The desire for the oak is not an external demand imposed upon the seed. It is the seed expressing its intrinsic nature. So it is with human desire. When a vision rises unbidden within your soul, luminous, full of life, and utterly distinct from the mundane calculations of the ego, it is not a random accident of biology. It is the fingerprint of your destiny pressing softly against the veil of your awareness. It could not have arisen in you if it were not already meant to find its ultimate expression in your reality. Pause for a heartbeat. Let the defensive armor of your skepticism fall away. The longings that keep you awake in the quiet hours are not cruel illusions designed to mock your limitations. They are the silent blueprints of a universe that is already constructing your tomorrow, waiting only for your recognition to let it pour through. To understand why human desire so frequently transforms from a sacred blueprint into a source of agonizing torture, we must subject the mechanics of longing to rigorous psychological and philosophical deconstruction. We must employ the method of recursive thinking, drilling past the surface symptoms of emotional yearning to expose the profound ontological error that governs modern consciousness. First layer. Why does man look upon his deepest desires and immediately feel an overwhelming sense of lack and separation? Because he evaluates the validity of his desire through the distorted lens of his current sensory data. He looks at his bank account, his present social circle, or his physical limitations, and concludes that what he feels inside is entirely separate from what is manifest outside. He assumes that reality is a fixed, immutable wall, and that his desire is merely a phantom standing on the other side of a locked glass door. Second layer, why does he assume reality is a fixed, immutable wall? Because he has mistaken the shadow for the substance. He believes that the physical world is the ultimate causative realm, that matter creates consciousness, and that physical circumstances dictate what a human being is allowed to experience. Consequently, when a grand desire appears within him, his materialist conditioning tells him that he must act upon the physical world to drag that desire into reality. Third layer, why does this materialist assumption corrupt the purity of desire? Because it turns the sacred process of creation into an act of violent imposition. By viewing the physical world as the master and consciousness as the servant, man places the cart before the horse. He believes he must force the universe to yield through struggle, convincing himself that the universe is initially opposed to his fulfillment. This creates a psychological fracture. The conscious mind splits into two opposing forces, the part that desperately wants the desire, and the part that continuously whispers the painful evidence of its current absence. This is the psychological genesis of the desire resistance loop. The moment a human being says, "I want X," while secretly believing "I do not have X," he initiates a psychological war against himself. The word want, in its deepest energetic root, is a declaration of lack. To want is to acknowledge the absence of the thing desired. Therefore, every time the striving architect tries to force his desire into manifestation using the energy of want, he is actually broadcasting a powerful, continuous frequency of not having. The universe, acting as an absolute mirror of consciousness, responds with exquisite, mathematical precision to the state from which it is addressed. It does not hear the words of the desire, it feels the underlying assumption of the state. How does this manifest in the theater of daily life? It manifests as the chronic, low-grade heartbreak of unfulfilled potential. It is the artist who spends decades drafting proposals for masterpieces he never paints because he is paralyzed by the fear that the canvas will not match his vision. It is the seeker who hops restlessly from one spiritual technique to another, hunting for a magical formula that will finally convince the cosmos to validate his worth. Yet, psychological and metaphysical depth reveals a breathtaking truth. Desire is not a petition submitted to an external authority. It is the self-recognition of what is already structurally integrated into the infinite fabric of being. Consciousness does not create anything new. It merely unfolds into physical form what has already been established in the realm of imagination. The desire is the mold. The physical manifestation is merely the metal poured into it. If the mold is cracked by doubt, the metal of experience will emerge distorted and flawed. When you grasp this, the entire paradigm of ambition shifts. You realize that your longings are not distant islands across a treacherous ocean. They are native soil calling out to be claimed. The universe does not withhold your desires because you are unworthy. It simply waits for you to stop treating your own destiny like an interloper. In the high, sun-bleached hills of Carrara, during the golden zenith of the Italian Renaissance, there lived a master stonemason named Giovanni. While his peers were renowned for their ability to quarry massive blocks of marble and carve them into ornate, symmetrical columns for the grand basilicas of Florence, Giovanni possessed a reputation that bordered on the miraculous. It was said that Giovanni did not carve stone, he liberated souls trapped within the mountain. When visitors and young apprentices gathered in his dusty, marble-scented courtyard, they watched a process that defied all conventional logic of art. Giovanni would walk past towering, flawless blocks of white marble without touching them. Instead, he would stand for hours before a completely empty space in the corner of his workshop, a space containing nothing more than the shafts of golden sunlight piercing through the high wooden rafters. He would close his eyes. His breath would slow to an imperceptible rhythm. His hands, rough and calloused from decades of labor, would gently shape the empty air as though he were caressing the curves of an invisible body. For weeks he would do this. He would not pick up a chisel. He would not draft a single charcoal sketch on paper. When frantic patrons arrived demanding to see progress on their commissioned statues, Giovanni would simply smile serenely and say, "The stone has not yet been asked to yield. The form is already complete. I am merely learning its contours in the silence." One spring morning, a wealthy and impatient cardinal from Rome arrived at the workshop, flanked by guards and furious over months of delay. He strode up to Giovanni, pointing a jeweled finger at the empty corner where the master stood with his eyes closed. "Master Giovanni," the cardinal barked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I have paid you a king's ransom for the statue of the Archangel Michael to grace my cathedral. For 3 moons I have watched you stand here playing with shadows and empty air while my rivals dedicate cathedrals filled with stone. Where is the work? Show me the marble." Giovanni opened his eyes. There was no anger in his gaze, only a deep luminous compassion, like that of an ancient physician looking upon a healthy man screaming that he was bleeding to death. He gestured quietly toward a massive, 3-ton block of rough, unhewn Carrara marble that sat in the center of the courtyard, a block covered in chalk marks, jagged crosshatches, and deep, violent gouges where an apprentice had spent weeks hacking away at the stone in a desperate attempt to force a wing into existence. "Your Eminence," Giovanni said softly, his voice carrying the resonant weight of a cathedral bell, "look at that stone. For 40 days, my most ambitious pupil has attacked it with a heavy iron mallet and a hardened steel chisel. He has sweated blood upon its surface. He has cursed the stubbornness of the grain. And what has he produced? A ruined fragment of broken rock, jagged and lifeless, because he believed the shape had to be beaten into the stone through sheer force of will." The cardinal frowned, crossing his arms. "That is the price of creation, sculptor. Art is war against raw matter." "No," Giovanni replied, stepping over to the empty corner where the sunlight pooled upon the flags. Creation is recognition. Long before my pupil ever struck that marble with his hammer, the Archangel Michael was already complete in the realm of formless thought. The stone was never an obstacle to be conquered. It was merely the dense, sleeping medium chosen to mirror what was already true in consciousness. Giovanni picked up a small, delicate wooden mallet and a thin, silver-tipped chisel. He walked over to the ruined block of marble. He did not raise the mallet high to deliver a crushing blow. Instead, he placed the chisel against a tiny, seemingly insignificant ridge near the edge of the stone, and with a single, feather-light tap no louder than the click of a falling pine cone, he struck. Clack. Instantly, a massive, hidden seam in the marble, a fissure that no human eye could have detected from the surface, opened cleanly along the grain. A large, jagged slab of superfluous stone slid silently away from the block, revealing beneath it the pristine, breathtaking curve of an angel's wing, polished and smooth as river glass, as though it had been waiting beneath the surface for 1,000 years. The cardinal staggered back, his jaw slack, staring in silent awe at the flawless marble wing that had emerged without a struggle. "You see," Giovanni whispered, turning back to the breathless courtyard. "When you know the form is already real in the unseen, you do not need to fight the material world. You simply remove the debris of your own doubt, and the universe does the rest." The parable of the master sculptor is not a relic of the Italian Renaissance. It is the living blueprint for how your own reality is constructed. You have spent your entire life treating your desires like raw, unyielding marble that must be beaten into shape through the brute force of your anxiety. You have hacked away at your circumstances with heavy iron mallets of strategy and self-doubt, wondering why your life resembles a pile of jagged, broken stone rather than a masterpiece of grace and fulfillment. It is time to put down the heavy iron mallet. This does not mean your desires are mere fantasies to be admired from afar. True realization is not the passive waiting of a beggar. It is the sovereign posture of the Creator, who recognizes that the blueprint of the desire and the substance of its manifestation are one and the same. Take a slow, grounding breath. Feel the absolute stillness at the center of your being. Recognize that the longing burning in your chest right now is not an accidental visitor. It is the universe knocking at the door of your own consciousness, presenting you with the exact design of the life you were born to inhabit. You are not required to invent the path, calculate the odds, or force the world to bend to your fragile will. You are simply required to recognize that the desire within you is the fingerprint of your destiny, and that what belongs to your destiny is already seeking you with the inexorable gravity of a falling star. If you accept this truth today, what would change? The frantic scramble for validation would cease. The exhausting calculation of probabilities would dissolve into the quiet certainty of knowing that creation is already finished in the invisible realm. You stand now at the threshold of Chapter 3. Having discovered that your desires are not random wishes but sacred blueprints, we must now confront the catastrophic error that ruins almost every seeker's journey: the confusion of roles. Why do humans insist on stepping into the engine room of the cosmos to shovel coal when the locomotive is already guided by an infinite intelligence? As you prepare to cross this next threshold, carry this single, unshakable truth into the silence of your evening. The desire you hold is not something you must chase across an empty world. It is the universe recognizing itself through you, waiting only for your permission to step out of the shadow and into the light. The mahogany walls of the high-rise office absorb the dying amber light of the autumn dusk, reflecting a panorama of glittering concrete and crawling traffic far below. At the center of the vast, minimalist room sits a man whose physical stillness belies a tempest of inner orchestration. His fingers fly across the glowing keys of his terminal, while his eyes dart incessantly between 3 separate monitors displaying financial models, global logistics pathways, and intricate spreadsheets of social leverage. Beside him lies a leather-bound journal filled with dense, color-coded matrices of who knows whom, which strategic alliance must be courted, which door must be hammered upon, and what exact combination of charm and unyielding pressure will force the marketplace to yield his desired outcome. To the casual observer looking through the glass, he is the picture of modern executive mastery, the ultimate captain of his own destiny, shaping reality through sheer intellect and administrative dominance. But look closer, peer past the polished mahogany and the cold blue glow of the screens. Look at the rigid tension in his jaw, the shallow cadence of his breath, and the frantic, hunted look in his eyes whenever a single variable threatens to drift outside his control. What the world mistakes for sovereign mastery is actually something far more precarious. It is the desperate performance of a clerk who has locked himself inside the engine room of an ocean liner, convinced that if he does not manually shovel coal into every furnace and adjust every piston with his bare hands, the massive vessel will instantly plunge into the abyss. There is a profound paradox hidden in the machinery of human ambition. The moment a man appoints himself both the dreamer of the vision and the mechanical architect of its physical assembly, he sentences himself to an eternity of frantic labor. Consider the anatomy of this self-imposed servitude. The human ego looks upon the vast, self-regulating cosmos, a universe that spins galaxies, orchestrates seasons, and coordinates billions of biological symphonies without a single moment of human anxiety, and immediately concludes that personal success is the one exception to the rule. It decides that while the stars can manage themselves, a corporate contract, a healing relationship, or a creative breakthrough cannot possibly manifest unless the conscious mind personally oversees every microscopic bolt and screw. The seeker becomes a tyrant to his own peace. He maps the human terrain like an invading general, scheming over introductions, engineering coincidences, and pushing against closed doors with the bruised knuckles of his own willpower. When a door refuses to swing open on his precise schedule, he does not pause to wonder if he is battering down an entrance that leads to a dead end. Instead, he constructs a heavier battering ram. He works longer hours, sleeps less, and doubles down on his strategies, convinced that failure is merely a sign that his effort was quantitatively insufficient. And all the while consciousness, the infinite, inexhaustible intelligence that is the true substance of all reality, watches this exhausting performance from the silent wings of the soul. It watches and it waits. It waits for the frantic architect to realize a truth that no amount of sweat can substitute for. You were never asked to build the engine. You were only asked to hold the destination in your heart. Pause here, suspended in the quiet room. Lift your hands from the invisible levers of your life. Let the frantic calculations dissolve into the gathering dusk. The burden you are carrying, the desperate need to orchestrate every detail, manage every outcome, and force every circumstance into alignment was never yours to bear. It is the weight of an usurper sitting upon a throne that belongs to a much greater king. To free oneself from the crushing weight of overmanagement, we must subject this catastrophic confusion of roles to a rigorous psychological and philosophical deconstruction. We must deploy the method of recursive thinking, drilling past the surface symptoms of control freakishness to expose the foundational ontological error that corrupts human agency. First layer. Why does man desperately insist on controlling the minute-by-minute execution of his desires? Because he fundamentally distrusts the invisible order of reality. He operates under the unconscious premise that if he relinquishes conscious management of even a single variable, chaos will instantly rush in to destroy his dreams. He believes that providence is passive and that only his vigilant, calculating intellect stands between him and total ruin. Second layer. Why does the intellect believe that reality is inherently chaotic and dependent entirely upon its vigilance? Because the intellect is structurally blind to the invisible dimensions of creation. The conscious mind can only process a minuscule fraction of the data operating in any given environment. It perceives linear cause and effect. A must lead to B through physical mechanics. Therefore, when it desires a complex outcome, such as a profound career shift or a deep healing, it assumes it must manually connect every single invisible dot, unaware that a vast, multi-dimensional web of intelligence is already capable of orchestrating 10,000 variables simultaneously. Third layer. Why does this intellectual limitation create a catastrophic confusion of roles? Because by trying to act as both the conceiver of the vision, the dreamer, and the physical constructor of every detail, the architect, the human psyche fractures. The dreamer supplies a magnificent, expansive desire, but the anxious architect immediately subjects that desire to the cramped, fearful limitations of past experience. The architect steps into the engine room, fires the crew of infinite intelligence, and tries to shovel coal by hand. This results in psychological burnout, chronic anxiety, and the ultimate sabotage of the very manifestation the seeker is trying to achieve. This is the psychological genesis of the interference trap. The interference trap occurs when the conscious mind, having planted a seed of desire in consciousness, refuses to let the seed germinate in the dark. Instead, it digs the seed up every single morning to check if roots are forming, watering it with anxiety and inspecting it with doubt. The seeker issues a clear command to the subconscious mind, "I assume this reality," and then immediately contradicts that command by acting as though the outcome depends entirely upon his frantic, daily manipulation of external people and circumstances. How does this manifest in daily life? It manifests as the exhausting compulsion to micromanage everyone around us. It is the entrepreneur who exhausts his team because he cannot bear to delegate a single task, convinced that no one else possesses his vision. It is the romantic who interrogates a partner's every word for hidden signs of abandonment, engineering emotional tests to force reassurance. It is the creator who rewrites the same paragraph 50 times until the living soul has been bled entirely out of the prose, replaced by clinical, sterile perfectionism. Yet psychological and metaphysical depth reveals a startling inversion. The frantic control exercised by the ego is not a sign of strength, it is the ultimate confession of powerlessness. True power is quiet, confident, and anchored in the absolute certainty of the finished result. It is only the weak, terrified ego that must scream, push, and micromanage every detail because it secretly knows its foundation is built on sand. When you confuse your role, stepping out of the sovereign posture of the dreamer who simply declares the end, and descending into the mud to sweat over the mechanical means, you cut yourself off from the infinite calculus of source. You trade the breathtaking precision of universal intelligence for the clumsy, myopic thrashing of your own anxious intellect. The universe does not need your architectural blueprint. It needs your willingness to step aside, surrender the method, and let the infinite intelligence do what it has done since the dawn of time. Turn a silent, held assumption into a living, breathing reality. In the ancient, sun-baked empire of Valoria, during the reign of Emperor Valerius II, the royal court reached an unprecedented peak of administrative sophistication. Valerius was a man of colossal intellect and bottomless energy. He believed that nothing in his vast empire, from the blooming of the imperial orchards to the movement of the celestial bodies across the night sky, could be left to blind chance. The emperor surrounded himself with thousands of scribes, astronomers, and engineers. Every courtyard had a clockwork mechanism. Every peasant was assigned a precise quota of steps per day. Every river was channeled through rigid stone aqueducts designed by the Royal Academy to prevent the disorder of natural flooding. Valerius prided himself on being the ultimate master of orchestration. "Without my mind," he would proudly declare to his ministers, "the empire would dissolve into barbarism within a single moon. I hold the sun in the sky with my vigilance." Yet, despite his total control over the mechanics of his kingdom, a profound and creeping melancholy settled over Valerius. His hair turned white before his time, his body grew gaunt and hollow, and he spent his nights pacing the marble balconies of his palace, terrified that if he closed his eyes in deep sleep, the empire would slip from his grasp. In the third decade of his reign, a severe and unprecedented drought struck Valoria. The great southern river, the lifeblood of the empire's agriculture, began to shrink. The crops withered in the dust, and panic rippled through the provinces. True to his character, Emperor Valerius did not pray, he engineered. He mobilized 20,000 laborers to dig emergency canals. He drafted complex mathematical treatises on cloud condensation. He personally supervised the distribution of every single grain of reserve wheat, working 20 hours a day without rest, screaming orders at his generals, and driving his own body to the absolute brink of collapse. One suffocating afternoon, as Valerius stood over a vast topographical map in his war room, barking instructions for the rerouting of a distant mountain stream, his vision blurred. A searing pain gripped his chest. The maps dissolved into a blur of ink, and the mighty emperor collapsed onto the marble floor, his feathered quill clattering against the stones. When Valerius regained consciousness, he was not in his grand war room, nor was he surrounded by his frantic scribes. He lay upon a simple cot in a quiet, stone-vaulted courtyard at the edge of the imperial gardens. Sitting beside him on a wooden stool was an old, weathered gardener named Silas, who had tended the royal figs for over half a century. Silas was calmly pruning a gnarled olive branch with a small, curved knife, his movements fluid, unhurried, and saturated with a deep, radiant peace. Valerius tried to sit up, his voice cracking with panic. "The canals! The southern provinces! The harvest will fail. Why am I lying here? Bring my scribes at once. We must calculate the new flow rates before nightfall." Silas did not look up from his branch. He made a clean, effortless snip, and a dead twig fell silently to the earth. "Sire," Silas said, his voice as calm and steady as a deep well, "for 30 years I have watched you run through this empire like a frantic child trying to push the sun across the sky. You build aqueducts to fight the river. You scold the clouds for not raining on your schedule, and you exhaust your life force trying to construct every leaf on every tree with your own hands." Valerius glared at the old man, his chest heaving with indignation. "If I do not manage the empire, who will? Will the wheat grow by magic? Will the rivers flow from goodwill?" Silas smiled gently, laid down his knife, and pointed out toward the vast horizon where the sun was beginning to dip below the distant hills in a blaze of gold and crimson. "Look out there, Majesty," Silas whispered. "Did you command that sun to rise this morning? Did you draft a royal decree to instruct the earth on how to tilt upon its axis? Did you engineer the genetic code of this olive tree so that it knows how to draw water from the deep stone without a single human scribe standing over it with a ledger?" Valerius fell silent. The words struck him not with anger, but with the terrifying, liberating weight of truth. "The universe was running long before your ancestors learned how to write laws, sire," Silas continued softly, "and it will run long after your name has faded from the marble. You are not the architect of the cosmos. You are merely the garden. When you try to step into the engine room and force every gear to turn by your own muscle, you break the machine and you break your own heart. Stop pushing the river, Valerius. Put down the quill. Let the intelligence that built the world run the world." The emperor looked down at his trembling, calloused hands that had spent a lifetime holding the reins of a forced reality. Slowly, for the first time in 30 years, Valerius opened his fists. He let out a long, shuddering breath, feeling the colossal weight of the empire slide off his shoulders and dissolve into the quiet evening air. He did not return to the war room that night. He slept deeply for the first time without fear, resting in the quiet, absolute certainty that the sun would rise again tomorrow without a single decree from his pen. The parable of the imperial monarch is not a distant historical myth. It is the exact mirror of your own psychological landscape. You have spent your life sitting in the war room of your mind, redrawing maps, panicking over delayed schedules, and screaming orders at an invisible universe because you were terrified that if you blinked for a single second, your life would disintegrate into ruin. You have played the part of the tyrannical architect in the engine room, exhausting your soul to manufacture outcomes that were already guaranteed by a much higher, infinitely wiser intelligence. It is time to step down from the throne of forced control. This does not mean descending into reckless negligence or abandoning your earthly responsibilities. True surrender is the ultimate sophistication of mastery. It is the profound realization that while your role is to define the vision, to be the sovereign dreamer who declares what is desired, the entire domain of the how belongs exclusively to Source. Take a slow, grounding breath. Feel the absolute stillness at the center of your being. Recognize that the anxiety you carry is nothing more than the phantom pain of an ego trying to play God. You are not required to orchestrate the 10,000 variables that must align for your desire to manifest. You are simply required to hold the vision in absolute faith and let the infinite intelligence do what it was born to do. If you surrender the engine room today, what would happen? The world would not stop spinning. Your desires would not vanish. Instead, something miraculous would occur. The constant grinding friction of your resistance would give way to an effortless, luminous momentum. You stand now at the threshold of Chapter 4. Having exposed the catastrophic error of the striving architect, we are ready to step into the core metaphysical mechanics of creation, the sovereign power of assumption. How does an individual shift from hoping, wishing, and begging to the immovable psychological posture of already possessing their desire? As you prepare to cross this next threshold into the absolute mechanics of manifestation, carry this single, unwavering truth into the silence of your evening. When you stop trying to build the bridge with your own hands, you finally give the universe permission to reveal the golden highway that was already waiting beneath your feet. The midnight mist rolls off the dark harbor, blurring the boundary between the stone quays and the infinite expanse of the sea. In a small, high-arched chamber overlooking the water, a solitary traveler sits in absolute stillness, holding a small brass key in the palm of his hand. He is not looking at a map. He is not drafting a petition, nor is he calculating the tariffs of foreign ports. His eyes are closed, yet his face bears the calm, unmistakable expression of a man who has already reached his destination. To anyone standing outside the chamber, he is merely a man sitting alone in the dark, separated from his homeland by 1,000 leagues of perilous water, surrounded by debt, uncertainty, and closed iron gates. But look closer. Peer past the superficial physical facts of his environment and examine the quality of his presence. He does not carry the frantic, vibrating posture of the petitioner who begs the heavens for a miracle. He radiates the quiet, immutable gravity of an owner resting within his own estate. There is a profound paradox hidden in the metaphysics of creation. The physical world does not respond to what you beg for. It submits entirely to what you assume yourself to be. Consider the anatomy of this shift. Most human beings live their lives as perpetual reactors to external circumstance. They treat physical reality as the master and their inner consciousness as the trembling servant. If the bank account is lean, they assume scarcity. If the room is empty of love, they assume isolation. They wait for physical proof before they allow themselves to feel secure, locking themselves into an endless, self-perpetuating loop where tomorrow is nothing more than a photocopy of yesterday. The sovereign creator operates on an entirely inverted axis. He understands that physical reality is not a solid, unyielding wall, but a sensitive, responsive mirror, an echo chamber that reflects back the precise tone of consciousness it is given. The traveler with the brass key does not wait for the harbor gate to swing open before he feels like a free man. He feels the cold metal of the key, smells the salt air of his destination, and inhabits the psychological reality of his arrival with such absolute sensory vividness that the physical ocean between him and his home becomes nothing more than a temporary illusion waiting to dissolve. Pause here, suspended in the amber of the present. Let the anxious inventory of your current limitations drop away. The life you desire is not hiding behind a locked door across an unbridgeable chasm. It is waiting for you to stop identifying with the shadow and step fully into the substance of your own assumed reality. To master the sovereign power of assumption, we must subject the mechanics of psychological creation to rigorous philosophical and psychological deconstruction. We must employ the method of recursive thinking, drilling past the surface dogmas of positive thinking to expose the foundational ontological laws that govern human consciousness. First layer. Why does man stubbornly believe that physical evidence must precede internal conviction? Because his entire evolutionary survival mechanism is anchored in sensory empiricism. He trusts what he can touch, measure, and see with his physical eyes. To the untrained mind, feeling wealthy when one is broke feels like a dangerous delusion, a reckless detachment from reality that invites ruin. Second layer. Why does this reliance on sensory empiricism trap man in a permanent cycle of repeating his past? Because if physical reality is always the result of past states of consciousness, then taking your cue from present physical circumstances guarantees that you will endlessly recreate the past. By declaring, "I am broke because my bank statement says so," you impress the reality of poverty deeper into the subconscious, ensuring that tomorrow's bank statement will mirror today's limitation. You are looking in the mirror and scolding your reflection for looking tired, expecting the glass to wash its own face. Third layer. Why does the assumption of the already fulfilled state break this self-perpetuating loop? Because assumption is not passive wishing, it is the active appropriation of a new psychological state. When you genuinely assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, you short-circuit the linear time lag of the physical world. Consciousness operates outside of linear time. By occupying the state of the desired end now, you alter the electromagnetic and spiritual frequency of your awareness, forcing the invisible matrix of reality to rearrange its coordinates to match your new internal residence. This is the psychological genesis of the law of assumption. The law of assumption states that assumptions persisted in and hardened into a feeling of reality inevitably externalize themselves in physical form. Most people fail in their manifestations because they treat assumption as a temporary mental exercise, a technique they apply for 10 minutes in the morning before stepping back out into the world to fret over their bills and lament their lack of progress. How does this manifest in the theater of daily life? It manifests as the profound dichotomy between the person who hopes and the person who knows. The person who hopes is always looking toward the future, keeping the desired object at arm's length. Every time he says, "I hope I get this job," he subtly reinforces the present tense reality of not having it. The person who assumes operates in the eternal present tense of the subconscious. He does not say, "This will be mine." He speaks, thinks, and reacts from the quiet, unshakable dignity of one for whom the matter is already settled history. Yet, psychological and metaphysical depth reveals a breathtaking truth. Your assumption is not a prayer thrown upward to a distant God. It is consciousness defining its own experience. The universe has no personal opinion about your worthiness, your bank balance, or your past mistakes. It does not judge whether your desire is too big or too small. It is a neutral, infinite mirror reflecting back the exact texture of your dominant psychological state. When you move from the agonizing oscillation of wanting into the immovable sanctuary of assumption, the entire architecture of your external life begins to bend. People you have never met move toward you. Doors you never knew existed unlock silently from the other side. The heavy armor of struggle falls away, replaced by the sovereign grace of a life that unfolds in absolute alignment with your inner truth. In the ancient walled trading city of Samarkand, at the crossroads of the legendary Silk Road, there lived a merchant named Tariq, whose caravans were renowned for bringing back unimaginable treasures from the forbidden Western empires. While other merchants spent fortunes bribing border guards, forging imperial seals, and navigating treacherous mountain passes with armed escorts, Tariq traveled with a single servant, unmolested and unburdened. His competitors whispered that Tariq possessed dark magic, or that he held secret bloodlines among the royal courts of Rome. But the truth of Tariq's method was far simpler and infinitely more profound. On the eve of a great expedition across the burning steppes to the forbidden citadel of Byzantium, a city whose iron gates were permanently barred to foreign merchants by imperial decree, Tariq's chief apprentice sat by the campfire, trembling with anxiety. "Master," the young apprentice whispered, clutching a bundle of forged documents and bribery coins to his chest, "we have no permits. The imperial guard at the western gate executes foreign traders on sight. How can we possibly hope to enter the citadel? Should we not turn back while the mountain passes are still clear?" Tariq looked up from the fire, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames with absolute, unclouded serenity. He reached into his traveling pack and pulled out an old, beautifully embroidered purple tunic, the ceremonial garb of an imperial guest at the Byzantine court, and laid it carefully across his knees. "My son," Tariq said softly, his voice carrying the weight of ancient rivers, "look at these documents in your hands. Look at your bribery coins. You are clutching the tools of a criminal trying to sneak through the back door of a world that does not want him. You are vibrating with the fear of the intruder." The apprentice swallowed hard. "If we do not sneak, we will be killed. The gates are closed. The gates are closed to the man who stands outside them begging for entry," Tariq replied calmly. "They are closed to the intruder who expects to be stopped. But to the guest whose chambers have been prepared since the foundation of the city, every gate is already standing wide open." Tariq did not spend the night drafting escape routes or plotting evasive maneuvers. He put on the purple tunic. He sat by the fire and visualized the cool marble floors of the imperial palace, tasted the sweet wine of the court, and breathed in the heavy scent of cedar and frankincense as though he were already walking the inner halls. He did not hope to enter Byzantium. In the quiet sanctuary of his imagination, he was already there. He inhabited the state of the honored guest with such terrifying sensory precision that the physical desert around him dissolved from his awareness. The next morning, the caravan approached the towering obsidian walls of Byzantium. In the high watchtowers, armed guards in gleaming silver armor stood with drawn bows, their faces stern and unforgiving. Below them, massive iron portcullises blocked the road, reinforced by heavy timbers and guarded by legions of veteran soldiers. The apprentice dropped his reins, paralyzed by terror. "Master, they see us. We are dead." Tariq did not slow his horse. He did not look at the guards, nor did he check his escape routes. He sat tall in the saddle, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze fixed straight ahead with the calm, indifferent dignity of a prince returning to his ancestral home. He rode forward not as a petitioner asking for mercy, but as a master occupying his rightful domain. As they reached the shadow of the massive iron gate, the captain of the guard, a brutal veteran with a scarred face, strode forward, raising his heavy spear to bar their path. The apprentice squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the whistle of the executioner's blade. Instead, a profound silence fell over the gate. Tariq reined in his horse smoothly, looking down at the captain, not with fear, but with the warm, familiar nod of a long-absent host greeting a familiar servant. The captain froze. He stared up at Tariq's face, then down at the purple tunic. Something in the merchant's unshakable posture, the absolute, total absence of doubt, the quiet frequency of a man who belonged inside the walls, shattered the captain's conditioning. The fierce warrior blinked, slowly lowered his spear, and stepped back. "Welcome home, Excellency," the captain murmured, bowing his head. With a heavy, groaning screech of iron chains and oiled pulleys, the massive portcullis rose into the stone archway, revealing the sunlit streets of the forbidden city stretching out before them in a golden panorama. Tariq did not look back at his trembling apprentice. He simply nudged his horse forward, riding through the open gate into the heart of the empire, proving once and for all what the wise have known since the dawn of time. The world does not bar its doors against the man who assumes his rightful place within it. The parable of the merchant of Samarkand is not an ancient fairy tale. It is the exact, unalterable law operating within your own life right now. You have spent years standing outside the gates of your own desires, clutching forged documents of strategy, trembling with the fear of rejection, and begging a silent universe to grant you passage. You have treated your dreams like forbidden fortresses, convinced that if you do not force your way in through cleverness and toil, you will be left out in the cold. It is time to put on the purple tunic. This does not mean descending into reckless delusion or ignoring the practical steps of living. True assumption is the supreme act of spiritual sovereignty. It is the profound realization that the moment you genuinely occupy the internal state of your wish fulfilled, the external world has no choice but to rearrange its physical architecture to reflect your inner reality. As this sovereign truth settles into the marrow of your bones, take a slow, deliberate pause. If the realization of your innate dominion has struck a resonant chord within your soul, honor that awakening by pressing the like button below. Subscribe to this channel to secure your place in this sacred sanctuary of wisdom, ensuring you remain anchored as we ascend to the next great revelation. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the absolute stillness at the center of your being. Recognize that the desire you carry in your heart right now is not something you must chase across an empty world. It is a royal estate waiting for its master to claim the keys. You are not required to fight the gods, force the doors, or engineer the timeline. You are simply required to step into the consciousness of already having and walk forward with the quiet, unshakable dignity of one who knows the outcome is already secured. If you step through that gate today in consciousness, what would happen? The frantic scramble for approval would cease. The crushing weight of anxiety would dissolve into the luminous certainty of a finished creation. You stand now at the threshold of Chapter 5. Having unlocked the sovereign power of assumption, we must now turn our gaze toward the very source of this infinite intelligence. Who or what is the silent power operating behind the curtain of your awareness? How do you commune directly with the infinite I Am that spins galaxies and coordinates the 10,000 variables of your destiny? As you prepare to cross this next threshold into the deep mystery of Source, carry this single, immutable truth into the silence of your evening. The gate was never locked against you, traveler. The key was in your hand the moment you decided to stop begging and started walking. The cathedral vault stretches upward into a twilight of incense and shadows, where centuries of human supplication have left their invisible residue upon the stone. Below, a solitary figure kneels upon the cold marble flags, hands locked in desperate petition, lips trembling with whispered pleas, bargains, and nervous justifications. He is addressing the empty expanse above the vaulted arches, directing his desperate longings toward an invisible entity seated somewhere beyond the stars, a distant, judgmental monarch weighing human worthiness, balancing ledgers of sin and virtue, and deciding with arbitrary majesty whether to grant or deny the petitioner's frantic prayers. To the orthodox observer, this is the eternal, sacred theater of faith. It is the posture of man bowing before the divine. But look closer. Peer past the flickering candlelight and the heavy architecture of organized supplication. Listen to the hollow echo of the prayers bouncing off the cold stone. What the world mistakes for holy devotion is actually a tragic case of mistaken identity. There is a profound paradox hidden in the human search for the divine. Man has spent millennia searching across the cosmos for a God to appease, completely unaware that the power he begs from is the very awareness with which he is begging. Consider the anatomy of this cosmic alienation. The human ego, trapped within the fragile container of skin and bone, looks out upon the terrifying vastness of the universe and immediately concludes that God must reside somewhere else, in a heaven above the clouds, behind a veil of mystery, accessible only through the right combination of holy words, ritualistic sacrifices, and emotional pleading. The seeker treats Source like an absentee landlord or a capricious emperor. He spends his life writing petitions, fasting, performing good works to buy favor, and trembling with anxiety over whether he has said the right formula to catch the divine ear. And all the while, the infinite intelligence remains closer to him than his own breath, quieter than his own heartbeat. It does not demand appeasement because it has never been separate from him. It does not judge his worthiness because it is the very substance of his existence. Pause here, suspended in the amber of the present. Let the ancient incense of religious anxiety clear from your lungs. Drop the petitions from your trembling hands. The power that moves the stars, that weaves the fabric of galaxies, and that holds the blueprint of your deepest desires is not sitting on a distant throne waiting to be begged. It is looking out through your eyes right now. To unmask the true nature of Source, we must subject the religious and philosophical conditioning of centuries to rigorous deconstruction. We must employ the method of recursive thinking, drilling past the anthropomorphic illusions of an external deity to expose the profound ontological reality of consciousness. First layer, why does man stubbornly project God as an external entity separate from himself? Because the ego requires a mirror outside of itself to validate its own fragile existence. If God is outside, then the ego can play the role of the humble subject negotiating, pleading, and bargaining for favors, thereby maintaining its separate, distinct identity through the drama of spiritual separation. First layer, continued. Second layer, why does this separation create lifelong spiritual exhaustion? Because treating Source as an external authority forces man into an endless cycle of spiritual politics. He feels unworthy, guilty, and disconnected, believing that his good must be smuggled down from heaven by divine grace or earned through relentless moral and physical striving. He prays for things he feels he lacks, thereby reinforcing the state of lack with every syllable of his petition. Third layer. What is the ontological reality of Source when stripped of all religious mythology? Source is not a person, a place, or a celestial king. Source is consciousness itself, the infinite, uncaused, primordial awareness that operates as the deepest layer of every living being. It is the absolute I Am. Not the small, anxious I Am that worries about bills and deadlines, but the vast, sovereign, timeless I Am that existed before your body had a name and will remain long after your name has turned to dust. This is the psychological genesis of the awakening of the self. When the mystic declares, I and my Father are one, he is not speaking poetry. He is stating the ultimate metaphysical mechanics of reality. The subconscious creative power within you is the exact same creative power that brought the cosmos into being. It does not evaluate your moral resume. It does not check whether you deserve abundance according to human rules. It simply takes the feeling tone of your dominant assumption and externalizes it with absolute mathematical neutrality. How does this manifest in the daily theater of life? It manifests as the profound shift from religion to realization. The religious man begs God to change his circumstances. The awakened master recognizes that his own consciousness is the causative substance and changes his inner state. He stops knocking on doors that lead nowhere and steps into the quiet realization that the kingdom of heaven is not a geographical location in the sky, but the internal kingdom of his own awareness. Yet, psychological and metaphysical depth reveals a breathtaking truth. Source cannot lead you when you insist on leading yourself. The infinite intelligence within you possesses a breathtaking omniscient capacity to arrange circumstances across time and space. It knows paths your eyes cannot see, introduces people your mind cannot calculate, and orchestrates synchronicity with a precision that defies all human engineering. Yet this intelligence is bound by a sacred law of non-violation. It will never override your free will. If you insist on playing the frantic architect shoveling coal, screaming orders, and white-knuckling your way through life, Source steps back into the silent wings and lets you struggle. It watches with infinite patience, waiting for the day your exhaustion finally breaks your pride, waiting for the moment you look up from your ledgers and whisper, "I surrender, take the wheel." In the high, snow-peaked valleys of ancient Tibet, deep within a monastery carved directly into the living granite of the mountain, there lived a young novice named Dorje. For 7 years, Dorje had studied under the great master Tenzin, performing the grueling physical labors of the temple while searching for the legendary keeper of the flame, the supreme deity said to dwell in the highest sanctuary of the mountain, who alone held the keys to enlightenment, peace, and the manifestation of all human needs. Every morning, Dorje climbed 1,000 stone steps to the door of whispers, carrying heavy golden urns of incense. He would kneel before the massive iron doors, pressing his forehead against the freezing metal, and chant prayers of supplication for hours, begging the keeper of the flame to look down upon his unworthiness and grant him liberation from his suffering. The doors never opened. The sanctuary remained as silent as the mountain snow. One bitter winter evening, as a ferocious blizzard howled across the peaks, threatening to tear the roof timbers from the monastery, the elderly Master Tenzin found Dorje collapsed in the snow before the door of whispers, shivering, exhausted, and weeping with spiritual despair. "Master," Dorje sobbed, his voice cracking against the wind, "I have fasted, I have prayed. I have offered my flesh and my labor to the keeper of the flame for 7 long years. Why does he remain silent? Why does he hide behind these doors while my soul starves in the dark?" Master Tenzin did not scold the boy. He smiled gently, reached down with a warm, steady hand, and pulled Dorje to his feet. "Come with me, my son," Tenzin whispered, his voice cutting through the howl of the storm. He did not lead Dorje back toward the cold stone stairs or the grand prayer halls. Instead, he led him down a narrow, unlit corridor deep into the bedrock of the mountain. Stopping before a heavy wooden door that led to the master's personal meditation cell, Tenzin pushed the door open. Inside the small circular room there was no altar of gold, no statues of wrathful deities, no burning incense. There was only a single polished sheet of dark obsidian glass mounted on the rough stone wall, reflecting the flickering glow of a single tallow candle. "You seek the keeper of the flame," Tenzin said softly, gesturing toward the dark mirror. "You have searched every temple, knelt before every altar, and begged every invisible god for the power that animates your life. Look now, see the face of the one you have been petitioning." Dorje stepped forward, trembling, and looked into the polished obsidian glass. At first he saw only his own reflection, the hollow cheeks, the tear-stained eyes, the ragged monk's robe. But as he stared deeper into the dark glass, past the surface image of his physical body, a profound and terrifying realization flooded his consciousness. The reflection was not merely a passive echo of light. Behind the eyes, looking back at him from the mirror, was an infinite, timeless, luminous vastness, a quiet, sovereign awareness that had been watching every prayer, listening to every sigh, and holding the universe in its embrace since before the mountain was formed. It was the I Am. Dorje fell to his knees, not in fear, but in the overwhelming, crushing relief of absolute recognition. "For 7 years," Tenzin whispered, resting a heavy hand upon the boy's bowed shoulder, "you have stood outside your own soul, banging on doors and begging a phantom god to give you what you already possess. Source is not an entity hiding behind the door of whispers. Source is the awareness that asks the question. It is the silent, infinite consciousness operating as your own mind. When you pray to an external god, You are water begging the ocean for a drop of moisture. Stop looking outside, Dorje. Turn the gaze inward and realize that the power you seek is the power you are. The parable of the Tibetan novice is not an exotic myth. It is the exact psychological mirror of your own spiritual journey. You have spent your life kneeling before external altars, pleading with circumstances, begging financial markets, relationships, and health to treat you with mercy, convinced that the power to fulfill your desires resides somewhere out there in the cold, indifferent cosmos. You have treated your own consciousness like a beggar at the gates of a palace. It is time to turn away from the empty doors and look into the mirror. This does not mean descending into arrogant ego inflation. True realization is the complete annihilation of the small, fearful ego, replaced by the majestic, quiet sovereignty of the divine I Am. It is the realization that the creative power of the universe does not live in a cathedral. It lives in the quiet sanctuary of your own awareness. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the absolute stillness at the center of your being. Recognize that the intelligence which beats your heart, circulates your blood, and dreams your deepest desires is not a distant judge. It is your very life. You are not required to buy its favor with suffering or earn its grace through endless striving. You are simply required to recognize its presence, align your assumption with its infinite power, and step into the quiet dignity of creation. If you accept this truth today, what would change? The anxiety of petition would vanish. The fear of unworthiness would dissolve into the absolute, unshakable certainty of divine wholeness. You stand now at the threshold of chapter 6. Having unmasked the true nature of Source, we must now confront the ultimate operational challenge, the forest guide and the rebel. Why does the anxious human mind insist on running ahead of the ultimate guide, arguing with directions, and choosing painful detours out of a desperate need to feel in control? As you prepare to cross this next threshold into the deep psychology of guidance, carry this single, immutable truth into the silence of your evening. You were never a beggar in a hostile universe, traveler. You were the sovereign creator of the cosmos, masquerading as a wanderer, waiting only for you to remember who you are. The canopy above is woven so densely with ancient black-green boughs that the sun is reduced to fractured splinters of amber light, casting long, skeletal shadows across a floor of damp, rotting moss and tangled briars. In this vast, unmapped wilderness, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of damp earth and resin, a solitary traveler stands gripping a rusted machete. His clothes are torn by thorns. His boots are caked in the mud of 100 false trails. His skin is pale with the exhaustion of a man who has not slept in days. He is surrounded by a labyrinth of impenetrable thickets, choked ravines, and deceptive clearings that all look identical beneath the twilight gloom. To anyone watching from above, the tragedy is not merely that he is lost in a hostile wilderness. The deeper, more haunting tragedy is visible in his posture. He is clutching a map he drew himself, while standing 5 paces away from a master guide who has walked these woods 10,000 times. There is a profound paradox hidden in the human relationship with guidance. Man spends his entire life screaming for a map from the heavens, yet when the ultimate guide appears to lead him through the dark, he insists on running ahead, arguing with every turn, and hacking his way through briars the guide specifically came to save him from. Consider the anatomy of this stubborn rebellion. The human ego, raised in a culture that worships intellectual independence and brute force self-reliance, looks upon the infinite intelligence of Source as a theoretical concept rather than a living, breathing, navigational presence. When a crisis arises, a career collapse, a shattered relationship, a creative block, the seeker asks for divine guidance. He closes his eyes and whispers, "Show me the way." Yet, the moment an intuitive impulse whispers an unexpected direction, a pull to remain still when panic screams to run, or a sudden urge to drop a long-cherished strategy, the ego panics. That makes no logical sense. The mind protests. How can we succeed if we don't force the issue? We must take matters into our own hands. And so, the traveler pushes past the guide, charges headfirst into the thickets of anxiety, and spends hours scaling vertical cliffs of resistance, exhausting his body and mind. All the while, the guide stands quietly at the mouth of a hidden level staircase just yards away, waiting with infinite patience for the rebel to tire of his own futile climbing. Pause here, suspended in the cool moss of the forest floor. Lower the rusted machete. Let the frantic desire to hack your way through through tomorrow's problems dissolve into the quiet gloom. The forest you are navigating is not an enemy territory designed to destroy you. It is a living sanctuary of unfolding intelligence, but you cannot find your way out while you insist on fighting the only one who knows the path. To heal this profound estrangement between human will and divine guidance, we must subject the psychology of rebellion to rigorous deconstruction. We must employ the method of recursive thinking, drilling past the surface symptoms of stubbornness to expose the foundational ontological error that causes man to fight his own deliverance. First layer. Why does the human mind violently resist intuitive guidance even when it is exhausted? Because guidance often asks the ego to surrender its cherished illusions of control, predictability, and linear logic. The ego equates surrender with death. It believes that if it stops fighting, planning, and micromanaging every variable, it will be swallowed by chaos and abandoned in the wilderness. Second layer. Why does the ego view the unknown paths of source as chaotic or dangerous? Because the ego's map of reality is constructed entirely from past memories, societal conditioning, and historical trauma. It only knows what has happened before. Therefore, when Source offers a completely novel, unplotted route, a sudden pivot, a quiet withdrawal, an unexpected door, the ego perceives it as a void, a threat, or a mistake, because it cannot trace the bridge using old calculations. Third layer. What is the true psychological genesis of this perpetual wandering? It is the deeply ingrained addiction to self-justification through struggle. Modern consciousness has been hypnotized by the belief that value is strictly proportional to suffering, that if a solution comes easily, without sweat, blood, and intellectual wrangling, it cannot possibly be legitimate. Consequently, when Source offers an effortless path around a mountain, the rebel rejects it, climbs the vertical rock face instead, and proudly calls his bruises proof of his character. This is the psychological genesis of the rebel's loop. The rebel's loop is the exhausting cycle wherein the seeker invites intelligence to lead him but appends a silent clause to his prayer, "Guide me, but only down the roads I approve of, according to the schedule I have drafted, using the strategies I have already invented." When reality inevitably violates these self-imposed rules, the rebel accuses the universe of failing him, doubles down on his defiance, and wanders deeper into the trackless briars. How does this manifest in the theater of daily life? It manifests as chronic decision fatigue. It is the professional who receives a clear, quiet inner knowing to leave a toxic corporate environment, but spends 6 months arguing with his intuition, running cost-benefit analyses, and seeking the approval of fearful friends until a health crisis forces him out. It is the creator who feels a distinct pull to alter his artistic direction, but clings stubbornly to the old formula because it feels safer, watching his inspiration wither into mechanical drudgery. Yet psychological and metaphysical depth reveals a breathtaking truth. The universe does not require your permission to guide you, it requires your cooperation. The infinite intelligence operating as your deeper self does not argue, coerce, or punish. It whispers. And whispers can only be heard in the absence of noise. When you fill your inner landscape with the frantic clatter of your own objections, what if this fails? What will they think? How can I afford this? You drown out the very guidance you knelt to request. True mastery is not the accumulation of more strategies. It is the cultivation of a profound, listening humility. It is the moment the rebel drops his weapons, looks at the master guide, and says simply, "I no longer know the way. I yield. Lead me." In the high, sun-baked gorges of the Taurus Mountains, during the height of the ancient trade caravans, there lived a legendary desert tracker named Malik. For over 50 years, Malik had guided emirs, merchants, and lost pilgrims across the scorching expanses of the Great Salt Wasteland, a region so treacherous that a single miscalculated league meant death by dehydration or quicksand. Malik's reputation was built upon a singular, unyielding axiom: the desert knows no masters save those who walk behind her. One spring, a wealthy young nobleman named Prince Cassian arrived at Malik's encampment, accompanied by a lavish retinue of 50 guards, 20 baggage camels loaded with gold, and a magnificent silver chariot. Cassian was a man of the Royal Academy, a brilliant scholar who had memorized every geographical treatise written in the libraries of Alexandria. He carried 3 parchment maps, meticulously drawn by the imperial cartographers, complete with compasses, protractors, and mathematical grids. Guide, Cassian announced proudly, unrolling his parchment maps upon the sand. We need not wander blindly through the dunes. My scholars have charted the exact coordinates of the oasis of the Seven Palms. We shall travel on bearing 300 degrees northwest, crossing the dry bed of the Serpent River. Malik looked at the intricate, colorful maps, then looked up into the young prince's proud, unyielding eyes. He shook his head slowly. Your maps were drawn 10 years ago, Prince, Malik said quietly. The great spring floods shifted the shifting sands. The Serpent River is no longer where your ink places it. If you walk on bearing 300 degrees, you will walk straight into the Valley of Glass, where the heat traps the wind and no man returns. Cassian laughed, rolling his maps back up with a dismissive wave. Old man, do not confuse your superstitions with science. My instruments do not lie. My calculations are absolute. You are merely here to carry my baggage, not to question my route. And so the expedition set forth. From the very first day, a silent war defined the journey. Malik walked at the front of the caravan, his eyes scanning the horizon, reading the subtle language of the wind, the flight patterns of the desert hawks, and the faint, shifting color of the sand dunes. Whenever Malik turned slightly east to avoid an invisible salt trap, Prince Cassian would rein in his horse, consult his compass, and shout angrily, "No! The map says northwest. You are wandering off course, tracker. Turn back to the grid at once." For 3 days, Malik yielded to the young prince's stubborn demands, attempting to steer the caravan around the dangers while accommodating the frantic geometry of the maps. But on the 4th afternoon, as they reached the edge of the forbidden Badlands, Malik halted his camel and pointed toward a vast, shimmering expanse of white salt flats ahead. "Prince," Malik said, his voice dropping to a solemn whisper, "if we take one more step in the direction of your map, we cross the threshold of the salt sink. The crust is thin, beneath it lies boiling mud. Turn the caravan south now. The true path winds through the canyon." Cassian flushed crimson with rage. He drew his jeweled riding crop, pointing it menacingly at the tracker. "I have tolerated your insolence long enough. We are losing time. Forward march." Malik looked at the prince with deep, luminous compassion. He dismounted from his camel, unslung his water skin, and laid it upon the sand. "The desert will teach you what the scholar refused to learn," Malik said softly. "I will wait for you at the southern oasis." With those words, the old tracker turned his camel around and walked away, disappearing into the heat haze of the canyon. Furious, Cassian spurred his horse forward, leading his 50 guards and 20 heavily laden camels straight onto the white crust of the salt flat. For the first half-mile, the ground held. Cassian turned back to his officers with a triumphant smirk, shouting, "See! The tracker was a coward! Science and strategy have triumphed once again." He had barely finished the sentence when the earth beneath his lead camel gave way with a sickening, hollow crunch. In a matter of seconds, the white crust shattered like glass. The boiling, treacherous mud beneath swallowed the lead camel whole. Panic erupted. The heavy baggage camels sank into the mire. The guards shouted in terror. The silver chariot began to slide downward into the gray, viscous depths. Cassian whipped his horse frantically, trying to escape the sinking trap, only to watch his magnificent steed collapse beneath him into the sucking muck. Stripped of his gold, his chariot, and his pride, Prince Cassian crawled across the burning salt flats on his hands and knees, dragging his ruined parchment maps through the filth, until 3 days later he collapsed unconscious beneath the shade of the palm trees at the southern oasis. When he opened his eyes, the cool water of the spring was touching his cracked lips. He looked up, and through the blur of exhaustion, he saw old Malik sitting beside him on a smooth stone, quietly sharpening a flint knife, his expression entirely devoid of mockery or triumph. Cassian stared down at his torn, ruined maps, which lay discarded in the mud by the water's edge. He wept bitter tears, not from the loss of his gold, but from the crushing, liberating realization of his own utter foolishness. "I was so certain I knew the way," Cassian whispered, his voice cracking. "I had the maps. I had the strategy. Why did I fight you?" Malik dipped a wooden cup into the clear spring water and handed it to the young noble. "Because the ego loves its maps more than it loves the destination," Malik replied gently. "You asked for a guide, Prince, but you wanted a servant who would follow your ignorance. The desert does not yield to your calculations. It yields only to those who surrender their pride and walk behind the one who knows the sand." The parable of the desert tracker is not an ancient campfire legend. It is the exact, unalterable mirror of your own psychological journey. You have spent your life wandering through the vast, unpredictable wilderness of your ambitions, clutching your self-drawn maps of strategy, arguing with the intuitive nudges of source, and marching defiantly into salt flats of your own making because you could not bear the thought of not being in control. You have treated your inner guidance like an irritating backseat driver, preferring the exhausting friction of your own intellectual planning to the effortless grace of divine alignment. It is time to hand over the map. This does not mean descending into passive helplessness or abandoning your intellectual faculties. True surrender to guidance is the supreme act of spiritual maturity. It is the profound recognition that while your mind is an extraordinary instrument for executing tasks, it is a catastrophic failure at mapping the future. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the absolute stillness at the center of your being. Recognize that the guidance whispering in your soul right now, no matter how illogical or unconventional it may seem to your rational mind, is the master tracker leading you safely past the invisible traps of your tomorrow. You are not required to know the full route. You are simply required to stop fighting the guide, step off your self-made salt flats, and walk quietly in the footsteps of the infinite intelligence that has never lost its way. If you surrender the map today, what would happen? The chronic anxiety of decision-making would vanish. The grinding friction of forced effort would dissolve into the smooth, inevitable momentum of synchronicity. You stand now at the threshold of Chapter 7. Having learned to follow the silent guide, we must now examine the operational mechanics of what happens when you move, the alchemy of action. Forced versus inspired. How do you distinguish between the heavy, depletion-driven labor of the ego and the weightless, miraculous momentum of inspired action? As you prepare to cross this next threshold into the deep alchemy of movement, carry this single, immutable truth into the silence of your evening. The path was never hidden from you, traveler. It was simply waiting for you to stop staring at your own maps and start following the footprints of the one who walks ahead. The clock on the mahogany wall of the high-rise office casts a cold, digital crimson glow across a cluttered desk buried beneath printouts, financial ledgers, and half-empty coffee cups. It is Cox, 9:00 a.m. In the heavy stillness of the sleeping city, a man sits hunched over his glowing terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a frantic metallic clatter. His eyes are bloodshot and wide, with a mixture of caffeine and terror. He lifts a heavy mobile phone to his ear, listening to the monotonous ringtone hum for the fourth time tonight. He is dialing a contact he has never met, a minor executive at a conglomerate 3 time zones away, pitching an emergency proposal constructed out of sheer desperation. Every word he speaks is saturated with the trembling frequency of lack. He is calling because he is broke, because his deadlines are expiring, because the walls of his professional existence are closing in, and because he believes that if he does not force something to happen right now, tonight, his entire life will collapse into dust. To any casual observer looking through the glass, this is the epitome of relentless entrepreneurial grit. Society names it hustle. It calls it paying the price of admission. But look closer. Peer past the frantic typing and the hollow, vibrating energy of the midnight call. Listen to the low, terrifying frequency humming underneath his voice. What the world mistakes for unstoppable drive is actually the violent thrashing of a drowning man punching blindly at the water. There is a profound paradox hidden in the mechanics of human effort. Action taken from the consciousness of lack is not a movement toward your desire. It is a broadcast of its continuous absence, deepening the very prison it attempts to escape. Consider the anatomy of this weariness. There are 2 entirely different lineages of human movement operating in the world, though they look identical to the physical eye. The first is forced action. It is born from the old state, the desperate white-knuckled vibration of the person who does not yet possess the thing he craves and is trying to bully the universe into compliance through brute force. Every phone call made from panic, every application submitted from anxiety, every conversation held from needy manipulation, these are heavy, friction-laden movements. They drain the vessel. By evening, the man who relies on forced action is completely hollow, his vital energy depleted, his nervous system fried by the constant friction of pushing a boulder uphill. The second is inspired action. It is of an entirely different chemical makeup. It is light, weightless, and born from the serene certainty of the wish fulfilled. It does not feel like forcing a door open. It feels like walking through an archway that has already been cleared by the unseen hands of Providence. Pause here. Suspended in the amber of the midnight silence, lower the phone from your ear. Let the frantic rhythm of your urgency slow down. The actions you are taking tomorrow out of sheer panic, are they building your temple, or are they merely digging your trench deeper in the mud? To master the alchemy of action, we must subject the traditional worship of hustle to a rigorous psychological and philosophical deconstruction. We must employ the method of recursive thinking, drilling past the surface dogmas of hard work to expose the foundational ontological laws that govern human momentum. First layer. Why does man instinctively believe that action must always be hard, painful, and accompanied by immense physical strain? Because his historical conditioning equates value with suffering. He has been taught from childhood that nothing of worth is ever given freely, that the universe is a harsh creditor demanding a heavy tax of sweat, tears, and nervous exhaustion before it will release its treasures. Second layer. Why does this belief in suffering as currency create the exhausting cycle of forced action? Because when you believe that effort is the cause of the result, you become addicted to the struggle. If a task is accomplished easily, without friction, the ego feels a strange sense of guilt or suspicion, whispering, "This cannot be real. It was too simple. We must have missed a step." Consequently, the ego deliberately manufactures complication, stress, and over-engineering to make the process feel appropriately agonizing. Third layer. What is the true metaphysical difference between forced action and inspired action? Forced action operates from the cause of lack. It attempts to use physical mechanics to alter spiritual reality. Inspired action operates from the effect of fulfillment. It is the physical body moving in organic, effortless response to an internal state that has already been realized in consciousness. When you are inspired, you do not push the river. You step into the boat because the current has already arrived at your door. This is the psychological genesis of the vibrational mismatch. The vibrational mismatch occurs when a seeker assumes the state of his desire in meditation, but the moment he opens his eyes and steps back into the physical world, he reverts to the old habits of forced, panic-driven labor. He writes emails that scream of desperation. He speaks to clients with the needy energy of a beggar. He chases opportunities with the frantic desperation of a stray dog. The universe, being an absolute mirror of consciousness, completely ignores the intellectual words he speaks and responds entirely to the vibrational frequency of his actions. How does this manifest in the theater of daily life? It manifests as the heartbreaking phenomenon of the hard-working failure. It is the person who works 14 hours a day, sacrifices his health, burns through every contact in his directory, and achieves absolutely nothing, while observing others who seem to move with effortless grace, making a single phone call that opens doors of gold. The difference is not luck. The difference is the alchemy of the state. When action is inspired by the state of already having, its energetic signature is entirely distinct. There is a curious lightness to it. Ideas arrive with a crystalline clarity that feels less like agonizing invention and more like divine downloading. Impulses pull you towards specific people, places, or tasks with an inner quietness that cannot be manufactured. Yet, psychological and metaphysical depth reveals a breathtaking truth. A single inspired action taken from the state of completion carries more creative momentum than 1,000 forced actions driven by despair. When you stop trying to manufacture outcomes through sheer muscular tension, you allow the infinite intelligence of Source to orchestrate the timing, the sequence, and the delivery. You become an instrument rather than a tyrant. And in that sacred transition, work ceases to be a curse and becomes a holy expression of joy. In the imperial city of Kyoto, during the quiet isolation of the Muromachi period, there lived two master silk weavers whose works were so breathtakingly exquisite that they were collected exclusively by the shogunate and the grand temples of the mountains. The first weaver, Master Kenji, was legendary for his punishing discipline. He worked in a vast, cold workshop lit by harsh iron lanterns. He tied weights to his wrists to build endurance. He lashed himself with verbal reproaches whenever a single thread strayed half a millimeter from his geometric charts. He worked 18 hours a day without rest, his face permanently etched with the bitter lines of unyielding strain. Art is war against the raw silk, Kenji would tell his apprentices, his voice rasping like sandpaper. Every knot must be beaten into submission through sweat and iron will. If your fingers do not bleed, your tapestry has no soul. The second weaver, Master Sora, lived in a small sunlit cottage at the edge of the bamboo forest. Visitors who peered into Sora's workshop were invariably stunned by what they saw, or rather, what they did not see. Sora often sat on his wooden veranda for days without touching a loom, drinking green tea, watching the wind rustle through the bamboo leaves, and listening to the singing of the river. When he finally sat down at his loom, he did not groan, sweat, or curse the threads. His hands moved with a liquid, effortless grace, not like a man building a wall, but like a master calligrapher whose brush glides across rice paper because the poem has already been written in his heart. One autumn, the imperial court announced a grand competition. Whichever master could weave the legendary tapestry of the four seasons, a work of unimaginable complexity depicting the shifting light of spring cherry blossoms and winter snows within a single bolt of silk, would be appointed the supreme artisan of the realm. Master Kenji immediately locked himself in his iron-lit workshop. He assembled 50 assistants, drafted 10,000 pages of mathematical weave patterns, and began a frantic, brutal campaign of forced labor. He slept 2 hours a night. He drove his apprentices to tears, screaming orders, ripping out sections of silk that did not meet his exacting geometric standards, and forcing every thread into place with white-knuckled fury. Master Sora, by contrast, spent the first 30 days of the competition walking through the autumn forests, sketching the curve of a fallen maple leaf, and meditating upon the quiet transition of the seasons. His apprentices panicked, whispering among themselves that their master had lost his mind. "Master!" his chief apprentice cried out 2 weeks before the imperial deadline. "The court emissaries arrive in 14 days!" Master Kenji has completed half his tapestry through sheer blood and toil. "We have not even strung our loom. How can you sit here drinking tea?" Sora smiled gently, set down his porcelain cup, and stood up. His eyes were clear, bright, and completely devoid of anxiety. "A tapestry is not woven with sweat, my son," Sora said softly. "A tapestry is woven in consciousness long before the first thread touches the wood. Kenji is fighting the silk. We are simply letting the seasons speak." Sora sat at his loom. For 7 days and 7 nights, his workshop did not echo with curses or the clatter of frantic corrections. There was only the soft, rhythmic hum of the shuttle moving back and forth with the steady, effortless cadence of a tidal wave. Sora did not force the design. He followed the inner vision that had been planted in his heart weeks before. Every movement was light, precise, and saturated with a profound, joyous peace. On the 15th day, the imperial judges arrived at the palace courtyard to inspect the works of both masters. First, they entered Master Kenji's workshop. The air was thick with the scent of exhaustion and nervous sweat. Kenji stood before his loom, pale, trembling, his hands bandaged in linen rags, his eyes hollow. His tapestry was massive, dense, and technically flawless. Every square inch had been beaten into submission with heroic effort. Yet, as the chief judge ran his fingers across the heavy silk, he frowned. The fabric felt stiff, rigid, and burdened with a strange, oppressive heaviness, the unmistakable energetic signature of anxiety and forced survival. Next, the judges walked to Master Sora's quiet cottage by the bamboo forest. Sora stood beside his loom, relaxed, smiling, dressed in clean robes, holding a fresh cup of tea. He stepped aside to reveal the tapestry of the four seasons. The judges gasped aloud. It was not merely a textile, it was a living portal. The cherry blossoms seemed to drift upon an invisible spring breeze. The winter snow caught the sunlight with a luminous, breathtaking fidelity that defied the limitations of thread and dye. Yet, most astonishing of all was the energy radiating from the fabric. It was light, luminous, and effortless, a pure, unadulterated transmission of joy and serenity. The chief judge dropped to one knee before Sora, bowing his head to the floor. "Master Sora," the judge whispered with reverence. "Kenji labored with the strength of 10 men, yet his work feels like a prison of stone. You sat in stillness, yet your hands have captured the very breath of heaven. By what magic is this possible?" Sora took a slow sip of his tea and looked out toward the sunlit river. "There is no magic," Sora replied quietly. "Kenji spent his life forcing the river to flow upstream, exhausting his soul to manufacture a result that his ego demanded. I simply learned to listen to the current. When the mind is aligned with the truth of the end, the hands do not need to struggle. They only need to follow where grace already leads." The parable of the two weavers is not a relic of feudal Japan. It is the exact, unalterable mirror of your professional and personal existence today. You have spent years living the life of Master Kenji, working yourself into a hollow version of who you were born to be, believing that if you do not suffer, sweat, and force every outcome into existence, you are failing. You have driven your mind and body to the brink of exhaustion, mistaking the heavy friction of your anxiety for the sacred fire of ambition. It is time to step out of the iron-lit workshop and walk into the sunlight by the river. This does not mean descending into laziness or abandoning your labor. True inspired action is not the absence of work, it is the absence of strain. It is the profound realization that when your consciousness is anchored in the state of the wish fulfilled, your daily actions cease to be desperate attempts to escape lack and become the joyful, effortless unfolding of a reality that is already yours. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the absolute stillness at the center of your being. Recognize that the next step you take tomorrow does not need to be forced through panic. It can be whispered from the quiet certainty of your own sovereignty. You are not required to push the river. You are simply required to let go of the oars, step into the boat, and allow the infinite intelligence of Source to carry you home. If you surrender the struggle today, what would happen? The crushing depletion of burnout would vanish, replaced by a steady, inexhaustible reservoir of creative energy. You stand now at the threshold of Chapter 8. Having mastered the alchemy of inspired action, we are ready to examine the living proof of this transformation, the case study of the relocated soul. How did a woman trapped in the suffocating streets of a dead-end metropolis abandon her frantic networking and watch her entire life rearrange itself in 2 weeks through the pure power of surrendered assumption? As you prepare to cross this next threshold into the living demonstration of the law, carry this single, immutable truth into the silence of your evening. A single step taken in alignment with Source moves mountains. Traveler, while 1,000 steps taken in panic will never carry you past the shadow of your own fear. The midnight rain beats a frantic, monotonous tattoo against the soot-streaked window panes of a cramped 7th-floor apartment, overlooking a congested avenue of the old metropolis. Inside, the air is thick with the stale scent of instant coffee and the cold, unyielding anxiety of stagnation. At a small, scarred wooden desk cluttered with resums, rejection letters, and dog-eared networking directories, a woman sits frozen. Her eyes are hollow, her shoulders hunched against the invisible weight of a year spent running on a hamster wheel of professional desperation. For 12 long months, she has treated her desire to leave this suffocating city like a military campaign. She has networked with the feverish efficiency of an operative behind enemy lines. She has sent out 300 applications, cultivated contacts through forced smiles at cocktail mixers, and checked her inbox 50 times an hour, with a heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. And what has it yielded? Nothing. Only automated rejections, ghostly silences, and a profound bone-deep exhaustion that tells her the universe is a locked vault. To the casual observer, she is the model of perseverance, a hard-working soul refusing to give up on her dreams. But look closer. Peer past the neat stacks of cover letters and the desperate efficiency of her schedule. Listen to the psychological vibration humming beneath her relentless activity. What the world mistakes for ambition is actually the frantic scrambling of a prisoner rattling the bars of her own cell, convinced that if she just shakes the iron hard enough, it will miraculously yield. There is a profound paradox hidden in the dynamics of geographical and circumstantial escape. The more frantically a soul tries to flee, the state of being trapped, the more tightly the invisible architecture of consciousness locks her into the exact environment she despises. Consider the anatomy of this trap. Most human beings believe that physical change must precede internal transformation. They assume that if they can just pack their bags, cross a border, or land a job in a new city, their inner misery will vanish. They treat their current location like a physical curse that must be broken by force. Yet consciousness operates on an absolute mirror law. It does not respond to your physical mailing address, it responds to your psychological residency. As long as this woman lived, breathed, and acted from the visceral consciousness of someone who badly needed to get out, her reality acted with absolute faithful obedience. It gave her more evidence of being stuck. It fed her more rejection letters, more financial strain, and more walls. Every phone call she placed was soaked in the heavy, repulsive vibration of not yet. Pause here. Suspended in the amber of the midnight rain, lower your pen. Let the stack of rasam slide from your fingers into the quiet dark. If the place you are trying to escape is merely a reflection of the state you are inhabiting, what good does it do to run across 1,000 miles of earth while carrying the same prison in your heart? To dismantle the psychology of the trapped seeker, we must subject this case study to rigorous philosophical and psychological deconstruction. We must employ the method of recursive thinking, drilling past the surface symptoms of professional burnout to expose the foundational ontological error that binds human consciousness to unwanted environments. First layer. Why does man believe that physical relocation or external restructuring is the primary cure for internal suffocation? Because he has been conditioned by a materialist culture to view the environment as the active agent and consciousness as the passive victim. He believes that his mood, his opportunities, and his peace of mind are manufactured entirely by his external surroundings, his city, his job, his bank balance. Second layer. Why does this materialist belief guarantee that wherever he goes, his struggles will inevitably follow him? Because wherever you go, you take your state of consciousness with you. If you flee a city while maintaining the psychological signature of a fugitive, frightened, bitter, and desperate, your new city will simply become a new theater for the exact same dramas. The outer geography changes, but the inner mirror remains identical. Third layer. What is the true ontological key that unlocked the woman's cage? The realization that she did not need to escape the city physically before she left it mentally. By shifting her psychological residence, abandoning the frantic posture of the trapped refugee, and assuming the serene, settled posture of one who already wakes up in her new home, she severed the energetic anchor holding her to the old metropolis. This is the psychological genesis of the residency shift. The residency shift occurs when a human being stops treating their present, unwanted reality as an immovable fact and begins treating their desired reality as an accomplished psychological fact. Most seekers fail because they try to negotiate with their current circumstances. They try to convince their present reality to become something else through argument and hustle. How does this manifest in the theater of daily life? It manifests as the sudden cessation of frantic activity, not out of laziness, but out of profound relief. When the woman was told to drop her networking lists, stop sending desperate applications, and go inward to genuinely inhabit the feeling of already living in her desired city, her first reaction was terror. If I stop pushing, her ego screamed, nothing will ever happen. Yet, psychological and metaphysical depth reveals a breathtaking inversion. When you stop pushing against the mirror, the reflection finally has room to change. The moment she stopped acting from the state of lack, the vibration of desperation vanished from her energy field. She began to walk around her current apartment, not as a prisoner in a cell, but as a traveler packing her bags for a journey that was already booked. She tasted the morning coffee of her new city in her imagination. She felt the different texture of the air. She inhabited the psychological coordinates of her arrival with such vivid sensory conviction that her present city began to feel like a place she had already departed. And then, with the inevitable precision of natural law, the invisible bridges began to form. In the waning decades of the 19th century, in the dense, fog-choked industrial labyrinth of London, there lived a brilliant cartographer named Julian. For 10 years, Julian had felt suffocated by the coal-scented air, the relentless grey skies, and the claustrophobic social strata of the British capital. His entire soul longed for the sun-drenched coast of the Mediterranean, to live among the olive groves of Florence, sketching the marble facades and breathing an air that felt alive. Yet, Julian's life was an exercise in agonizing striving. He spent every evening writing letters to wealthy patrons in Italy, soliciting academic posts, mailing portfolios to foreign academies, and attending stiff diplomatic receptions with a fixed, exhausting smile, trying to force a door to open through sheer social engineering. He was broke, sickly, and utterly demoralized. One evening, after receiving yet another formal rejection letter from the Florentine Academy of Arts, Julian collapsed across his drafting table, weeping tears of pure exhaustion. "Why does the universe mock me?" Julian whispered into the dark room. "I have worked, I have networked, I have done everything a man is supposed to do to earn his escape. Why am I still chained to this stone prison?" The next morning, too weak to hold a pen and too disillusioned to touch his networking letters, Julian did something he had never done in 10 years. He left his desk untouched. He walked over to his worn leather armchair by the unlit hearth, sat down, and stared blankly at the cold fireplace. Into the room stepped an old friend, a quiet, eccentric landscape painter named Master Alistair, who possessed a reputation for an unsettling, luminous serenity that defied the grime of London. Alistair looked at the weeping cartographer, then at the towering piles of unanswered rejection letters stacked like tombstones upon the drafting table. "You are working yourself to death, Julian," Alistair said gently, pulling up a wooden stool. "And for what? You are trying to blast your way out of a fortress with a wet paper straw?" "I must escape this city, Alistair," Julian groaned, burying his face in his hands. "If I do not secure a post in Florence by winter, I shall perish here. Every day I stay is a day stolen from my life." Alistair smiled quietly, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Listen to me, my friend. You are not trapped in London because London is holding you. You are trapped in London because your soul is currently residing in a prison of your own design. Every letter you write, every hand you shake, every prayer you utter is saturated with the screams of a refugee. You are broadcasting the state of not being in Florence with such deafening volume that the universe has no choice but to keep giving you more London." Julian stared at the painter, stunned. "What would you have me do? Sit here and fold my hands while my life rots away?" "No," Alistair replied, his voice dropping to a resonant whisper. "I would have you move your furniture. Not in this room, but in your mind. Go to Florence tonight. Not tomorrow, not when the Academy grants you permission. Close your eyes, walk across the threshold of your imagination, and wake up tomorrow morning in your villa above the Arno. Taste the wine, smell the cypress trees. Inhabit that reality so completely that when you walk down the foggy streets of London tomorrow afternoon, you do so not as a resident, but as a foreigner visiting a city he has already left." Julian was desperate enough to try anything. That night he abandoned his networking ledgers. He blew out the candles on his drafting table, climbed into bed, and used every ounce of his creative imagination to construct the sensory reality of waking up in Italy. He felt the warm morning sun strike his eyelids. He heard the distant church bells of the Duomo. He felt the utter, unshakable calm of a man who was already home. He did this for 14 consecutive days. The frantic hustle stopped. The letters remained unwritten. A deep, profound stillness settled over his spirit. On the 15th morning, as Julian sat by his window reading a volume of poetry with the quiet serenity of an Italian exile, a sharp knock sounded at his door. It was a courier holding a heavy cream-colored envelope bearing the official wax seal of the Florentine Ministry of Fine Arts. Julian broke the seal with trembling fingers. Inside was not a rejection, nor was it a cold bureaucratic form. It was a personal letter from the director of the Florentine Academy, stating that a patron and eccentric Italian nobleman who had seen one of Julian's minor sketches years ago in a forgotten London gallery had just endowed a permanent residency for him in Florence, complete with a private studio overlooking the river and a guaranteed commission for a grand panoramic mural. At the bottom of the letter was a postscript. "We have been searching for you across the capitals of Europe for 6 months, Mr. Julian. Your name was brought to our attention quite miraculously last Tuesday by an old colleague of yours who happened to mention your unmatched mastery of light." Julian dropped the letter. He looked out the window at the grey London fog, but he did not feel the chill. He smiled quietly, knowing the truth that the world calls coincidence. When you truly depart in consciousness, the physical world simply packs your bags. The parable of the 19th century cartographer is not a charming historical anecdote. It is the exact blueprint for your own relocation of soul. You have spent years rattling the bars of your current circumstances, your career, your relationships, your environment, convinced that if you just push harder, network louder, and hustle longer, the physical world will finally grant you parole. You have treated your present state as an inescapable cage. It is time to pack your bags in consciousness. This does not mean acting recklessly or ignoring practical responsibilities. True inner relocation is the supreme act of sovereign creation. It is the profound realization that the moment you genuinely inhabit the psychological residency of your desired reality, the physical universe will begin rearranging its logistics to match your new address. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the absolute stillness at the center of your being. Recognize that the life you yearn for is not waiting for a permission slip from the external world. It is waiting for you to occupy its rooms in the quiet sanctuary of your own imagination. You are not required to fight your current environment. You are simply required to stop living in it mentally and step across the threshold into the reality that is already yours. If you make that inner move today, what would happen? The frantic scramble for escape would cease, replaced by the calm, inevitable certainty of a traveler who knows his ticket is already booked. You stand now at the threshold of Chapter 9. Having witnessed the miraculous relocation of the soul, we must now learn how to read the divine instrument panel of existence, the compass of alignment, ease, energy, and peace. How do you distinguish between the grinding friction of resistance and the effortless momentum of synchronicity, using your own internal state as the ultimate navigational compass? As you prepare to cross this next threshold into the mastery of alignment, carry this single, immutable truth into the silence of your evening. You can never run fast enough to escape a prison built by your own lack of faith, traveler. But the moment you realize you hold the key, every door in the universe swings wide open. The midday sun beats down with an unsparing white-hot ferocity upon a desolate mountain pass where the air shimmers with dry heat and the scent of parched dust. Midway up the sheer, jagged incline stands a man whose body is locked in an agonizing posture of perpetual struggle. His muscular back is bowed double, his bare shoulders pressed against a colossal, jagged boulder of granite. Every tendon in his neck is corded like iron. His boots slip and grind against the loose scree. His breath comes in ragged, tearing gasps that burn his throat. Hour after hour, day after day, he pushes. He forces the boulder a few agonizing inches upward, only for his foot to slide, the stone to shudder, and the heavy mass to roll back down, bruising his shins and threatening to crush him beneath its weight. To any traveler looking up from the valley below, this is the classic, noble picture of human perseverance, a man conquering an insurmountable obstacle through pure, unbroken willpower. But look closer, peer past the dust and the straining muscle, listen to the psychological weather raging inside his chest. What the world mistakes for heroic tenacity is actually a tragic self-inflicted torture. There is a profound paradox hidden in the navigation of human destiny. When a man feels as though he is pushing a boulder uphill, the steepness of the grade is not a measure of the world's resistance. It is the absolute physical feedback that he is traveling in the wrong direction. Consider the anatomy of this blindness. Most human beings navigate their lives entirely by external markers, deadlines, resistance, institutional walls, and social friction. When a door is stuck, they assume they must hit it harder. When a project causes chronic depletion, they assume they must sacrifice pabicom does a project causes chronic depletion, where the amount of suffering endured is the primary currency of success. Yet, consciousness has provided every human being with an infallible built-in navigational instrument, an internal compass that never breaks, never lies, and never requires a battery. That compass is calibrated through three silent indicators: ease, energy, and peace. When you are operating from the alignment of source, movement possesses an organic momentum. Doors open with a naturalness that startles the intellect. Actions, no matter how vigorous, replenish rather than deplete the vessel. Even in the face of temporary challenge, there remains a deep, unshakable reservoir of inner quietude. When you are forcing, everything is friction. Every conversation requires exhausting persuasion. Every morning demands an act of brutal psychological violence to drag yourself out of bed. Every delay feels like a personal catastrophe. Pause here, suspended in the dry heat of the mountain pass. Let your hands drop from the cold granite of the boulder. Step away from the stone. The mountain you are trying to conquer was never meant to be scaled by brute force. What if the path you seek is not up the jagged cliff of struggle, but around the gentle flowering slope on the other side? To master the divine compass of alignment, we must subject the cultural worship of struggle to rigorous psychological and philosophical deconstruction. We must employ the method of recursive thinking, drilling past the surface symptoms of professional and personal burnout to expose the foundational ontological laws that govern human energy. First layer. Why does man stubbornly continue to push against friction long after every indicator has warned him to stop? Because his ego has fused his identity with the struggle. He believes that if he abandons a difficult path, he is admitting defeat. He equates ease with laziness and friction with righteousness, convinced that a goal is only valuable if it required immense suffering to attain. Second layer. Why does this false equation between suffering and value blind the intellect to the signals of the internal compass? Because the intellect is trained to look outward for validation. It reads external obstacles as moral challenges, tests sent by fate to prove his worthiness. Therefore, when a project runs into endless walls of resistance, the ego interprets it not as a signal to pivot, but as a cue to redouble its efforts, mistaking stubbornness for faith. Third layer. What is the true metaphysical function of friction, ease, energy, and peace within human experience? Friction is the spiritual alarm system. It is the absolute feedback mechanism of the universe signaling that you are acting from the state of lack and forcing reality against its grain. Ease, energy, and peace are the navigational green lights of source. They indicate that your inner assumption and your outer momentum are moving in seamless, unified harmony. This is the psychological genesis of the compass calibration. The compass calibration requires a radical inversion of how a human being makes decisions. Instead of asking, "What is the most aggressive strategy I can deploy to conquer this obstacle?" the aligned master asks, "Where is the ease? Where is the energy? Where is the peace?" How does this manifest in the theater of daily life? It manifests as the sudden, fearless willingness to abandon projects, relationships, or paths that are saturated with chronic depletion, even when those paths look logical on paper. It is the entrepreneur who walks away from a lucrative contract because every interaction with the client induces a knot of anxiety in his stomach, only to discover a week later that a far superior opportunity opened up naturally in a different sector. It is the creator who scraps an entire manuscript because the writing felt like pulling teeth, and writes a masterpiece in 3 days when he finally aligns with his true voice. Yet, psychological and metaphysical depth reveals a breathtaking truth. Your internal state is the ultimate barometer of your external manifestation. You cannot feel chronically depleted, anxious, and strained while walking a path of divine alignment. That is a metaphysical impossibility. The emotional and energetic climate of your inner world is inextricably linked to the trajectory of your outer destiny. When you learn to read the compass of ease, energy, and peace, decision-making ceases to be an agonizing gamble. You stop consulting the chaotic opinions of the world and begin listening to the quiet, infallible feedback of your own sovereign awareness. In the fierce, icy waters of the northern Atlantic, during the height of the 19th century merchant sailing fleets, there lived a legendary sea captain named Thorolf. While other captains navigated by rigid mathematical grid navigation, forcing their heavy three-masted schooners straight through ferocious gales, breaking spars, tearing canvas, and losing men overboard in their obsessive adherence to predetermined compass bearings, Thorolf's ship, the Northern Star, always arrived at its destination ahead of schedule, with undamaged hulls and rested crews. It was whispered among the maritime guilds of Oslo and Liverpool that Thorolf possessed a supernatural gift, that he could command the winds and quiet the waves through ancient Nordic sorcery. In the autumn of 1874, Thorolf was tasked with delivering a critical cargo of winter provisions across the treacherous Norwegian Sea during the height of the equinoctial storms. Aboard his ship as an observer was a young, arrogant officer of the Royal Naval Academy named Lieutenant Vance, who carried a trunk filled with the most advanced brass sextants, chronometers, and astronomical charts produced in Europe. On the third day out, as the ship cleared the shelter of the fjords, a massive black-bellied storm swept down from the Arctic, turning the sea into a boiling cauldron of grey foam and howling winds. Lieutenant Vance scrambled onto the quarterdeck, clutching his brass sextant, his face pale with panic. "Captain Thoralf," Vance screamed over the roar of the gale. "The barometric pressure has plummeted off the scale. Our navigational chart dictates that we maintain a heading due west straight through the center of this depression to reach the trade lanes. If we do not lash the wheel and hold our course, we shall be driven onto the jagged reefs of the northern shelf." Thoralf stood calmly at the helm. He was not gripping the wooden wheel with white-knuckled tension. His hands rested lightly upon the spokes, his eyes closed, his face turned toward the stinging spray of the salt wind. He did not consult a map, he was listening. "The storm is telling us not to go west, Lieutenant," Thoralf said quietly, his voice remarkably serene amid the chaos of the gale. Vance stared at him in utter disbelief. "The storm is a meteorological event. It does not speak. It is an obstacle to be conquered through superior seamanship and rigid adherence to our course. Tie yourself to the mast, Captain, or I shall relieve you of command." Thoralf opened his eyes. There was no anger in his gaze, only the vast, deep stillness of the open ocean. "Look at the ship, Vance," Thoralf commanded, gesturing around them. The young officer looked. Every line on the deck was screaming under intolerable tension. The mainmast groaned like a dying beast. The timbers shrieked in protest, the crew were bruised, exhausted, and bleeding from their efforts to keep the ship pointed west against the fury of the headwinds. Every inch of forward progress was bought with an agonizing price of strain and depletion. "That is what happens when you force the vessel against the current," Thoralf whispered. "The sea is not our enemy, Lieutenant, but she will break any man who tries to bully her." Without waiting for Vance's consent, Thoralf spun the wheel. He did not turn west into the heart of the gale. He eased the helm over, letting the ship fall away from the wind, turning her bow toward the south-southeast, sliding smoothly into a deep, hidden trough between the colossal swells. Instantly, a profound and startling transformation occurred. The shrieking of the rigging dropped to a steady rhythmic hum. The violent, bone-jarring battering of the waves ceased. The ship lifted gracefully on the swells, surging forward with a sudden, breathtaking velocity that felt less like fighting the water and more like flying across it. Vance staggered against the bulwarks, grabbing a shroud for balance, staring at the compass in absolute bewilderment. "You've turned us away from our destination. We are heading south. We are off course." "We are not off course," Thoralf replied, smiling as he adjusted the main sheet with effortless ease. "We have simply stopped fighting the architecture of the sea. There is an undersea thermal current, a great river running beneath the storm that curves south before sweeping in a grand arc directly into the northern ports. If we had fought west, the storm would have crushed us. By yielding to the contour of the water, the storm itself is now carrying our weight." For 2 days, the northern star glided through the southern arc, untouched by the fury of the central gale, while fueled entirely by the momentum of the hidden current. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the clouds parted in a brilliant vault of golden light, the ship glided smoothly into the calm, protected waters of the northern harbor, docking precisely on schedule without a single torn sail or a single injured sailor. Lieutenant Vance walked slowly down the gangplank onto the stone quay. He looked back at the unblemished hull of the schooner, then down at his expensive, ruined navigational charts scattered across the deck. He finally understood what the old sea captain had known all along. The universe does not reward the man who fights the hardest. It delivers the man who reads the current and surrenders to the flow. The parable of the northern sea captain is not a nautical anecdote. It is the exact, unalterable mirror of your daily decision-making. You have spent years sailing your life straight into the howling gales of professional and personal resistance, convinced that if you are not suffering, bleeding, and fighting headwinds, you are not making progress. You have ignored the internal compass of ease, energy, and peace, treating your exhaustion as a badge of honor. It is time to look at the compass. This does not mean running away from every minor challenge or shrinking from hard work. True alignment is the profound recognition that when you are on the path assigned by Source, the energetic signature of your movement changes. The friction dissolves, the energy renews itself, the deep, unshakable peace beneath the activity confirms that you are moving with the current of the cosmos. As this navigational truth settles into the marrow of your bones, take a slow, deliberate pause. If the truth of following the compass of ease and peace has brought a profound sense of clarity to your chest, honor that inner shift by pressing the like button below. Subscribe to this channel to secure your place in this sacred sanctuary of wisdom, ensuring you remain anchored as we ascend. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the absolute stillness at the center of your being. Recognize that the next decision you face does not require a desperate gamble against friction. It requires a quiet glance at your own internal state. If it drains your life force, pause. If it requires frantic manipulation, let it go. If it hums with a quiet, effortless frequency of ease and peace, follow it with your whole heart. You are not required to force your destiny. You are simply required to read the current. You stand now at the threshold of Chapter 10, the final sacred culmination of our cinematic manuscript, the Sabbath of the unseen creation. How do you maintain absolute, unshakable faith during the silent, invisible gestation period when the physical world offers no proof, yet the harvest is already ripening beneath the winter frost? As you prepare to cross this final, magnificent threshold into the Sabbath of the soul, carry this single, immutable truth into the silence of your evening, when ease is your compass and peace is your anchor. Traveler, you can never be lost, for the entire universe is conspiring to carry you home. The first profound frost of the deep alpine winter blankets the high plateau in an unbroken mantle of diamond-crusted white, silencing the rustle of the dry autumn stalks and wrapping the ancient earth in a shroud of absolute, majestic stillness. In this frozen sanctuary, every visible sign of life has vanished. The fields are barren, the branches are skeletal, the topsoil is hard as iron. To the impatient eye of the casual observer walking across the frozen crust, this is a landscape of utter death and abandonment. It appears that the earth has failed, that the harvest has been permanently denied, and that the long months of labor have yielded nothing but an empty, frigid void. Yet beneath that hard, unyielding crust of ice and frost, a breathtaking, silent alchemy is occurring. The seed planted in the autumn dark is not rotting in despair. It is undergoing the sacred, invisible gestation of creation. Its hard outer shell is softening, its deep taproot is quietly drinking from the hidden subterranean springs, and its cellular memory is orchestrating the microscopic architecture of a magnificent oak tree that will soon pierce the spring sunlight. There is a profound paradox hidden in the interval between assumption and manifestation. The period of greatest apparent inactivity in the physical world is invariably the period of greatest, most precise orchestration in the unseen realms of consciousness. Consider the anatomy of this sacred waiting. Most human beings possess a terrifying intolerance for the invisible. They plant their mental seeds of desire through meditation and assumption, but the moment they step back out into the physical world and see no immediate evidence of change, panic sets in. They dig the seed up. They check for roots. They demand that the invisible world render an immediate accounting of its progress. Where is the proof? The impatient ego screams. Days have passed, weeks have passed, nothing has changed. And so, through their frantic checking, their nervous doubt, and their desperate attempts to force the evidence into being ahead of its natural season, they shatter the delicate embryonic structures of their own manifestation. They kill the harvest in the dark because they do not understand the mechanics of the Sabbath. Pause here, suspended in the crystal silence of the winter frost. Let the frantic demands for immediate physical proof fall from your hands. The silence you see in your life right now is not the silence of denial, it is the sacred stillness of the womb. To master the sacred interval of creation, we must subject the psychology of waiting to rigorous philosophical and psychological deconstruction. We must employ the method of recursive thinking, drilling past the surface anxiety of delay to expose the foundational ontological laws that govern the manifestation of form. First layer. Why does man experience such intense psychological agony during the period when his desire is unmanifested in the physical world? Because his identity is still anchored in sensory empiricism. He believes that if he cannot touch it, see it, or measure it, it does not exist. Therefore, a delay between internal assumption and external visibility feels like a rejection, a failure, or a sign that his spiritual mechanics have broken down. First layer continued. Second layer. Why does this anxiety compel the ego to interfere with the unfolding process? Because the ego operates from lack. It perceives time as a linear enemy, a ticking clock that threatens to run out before its safety or happiness is secured. Consequently, when time passes without physical evidence, the ego panics, assumes the role of the hypervigilant manager, and begins frantically digging up the soil to inspect the seed. Third layer. What is the true metaphysical reality of the Sabbath interval? The Sabbath is not a punishment or a waiting room. It is the sacred law of gestation. Just as a human child requires 9 months of invisible cell-by-cell formation in the dark womb before it can step into the light, every significant desire requires an interval of subconscious orchestration. During this time, infinite intelligence is aligning 10,000 variables across time and space, coordinating people, resources, timing, and circumstance to ensure that when your desire manifests, it does so with absolute perfection and stability. This is the psychological genesis of the saboteur of impatience. The saboteur of impatience is the voice that whispers, "Be realistic. It's been weeks. It's time to take matters back into your own hands. You need to force something to happen." When a seeker listens to that voice, he steps out of the Sabbath, he abandons his rest, picks up his heavy tools of forced labor, and plunges back into the frantic rapids of the ego. In doing so, he halts the invisible orchestration of Source, replacing divine precision with clumsy human interference. How does this manifest in the theater of daily life? It manifests as the chronic cycle of almost manifestation. It is the person who assumes a state, feels the deep peace of the wish fulfilled, but the moment a minor obstacle appears on day 5, he panics, revokes his assumption, and starts over from zero. Yet, psychological and metaphysical depth reveals a breathtaking truth. Every delay in a truly assumed manifestation is purposeful, protective, and precise. The universe is not dragging its feet, it is preparing the ground. It is moving people who have never met you into alignment with your destiny. It is clearing old debris from channels you cannot even see. When you learn to honor the Sabbath, remaining faithful to your assumption through the silent weeks and months without demanding premature physical proof, you cross the line from a struggling novice into a master of consciousness. You realize that your only job during the gestation period is to rest in the quiet, unshakable certainty that it is already done. In the ancient maritime republic of Venice, during the golden age of the Renaissance dockyards, there lived a legendary shipwright named Master Nickel. While other master builders were known for their noisy shipyards where hundreds of carpenters hammered day and night, shouting orders, sawing timber, and rushing hulls to completion with frantic speed, Nickel's workshop at the edge of the lagoon was shrouded in an eerie, impenetrable silence. For months at a time, the massive oak doors of Nickel's dry dock remained firmly bolted from the inside. No sound of saws could be heard. No smoke rose from the forge. The merchants of the Senate, who had commissioned the great flagship the Golden Lion for the Republic's armada, grew increasingly anxious. They would pace the stone quays outside the locked gates, banging on the heavy timber and shouting insults at the silent building. "Master Nickel," the chief magistrate would bellow. "6 months have passed since the contract was signed. Our fleets face war in the eastern seas, and your dry dock is as silent as a tomb. Where is our warship? Show us the keel. Show us the ribs of the vessel, or we shall seize your property for treason." The heavy oak doors remained bolted. No voice answered from within. One stormy afternoon, losing all patience, the magistrates brought a battering ram to the gates, smashed the iron locks, and stormed into the vast, vaulted interior of the dry dock. Fully prepared to drag the lazy shipwright before the tribunal, they froze on the threshold. The magistrates dropped their torches, their mouths hanging open in stunned, breathless silence. The interior of the dry dock was not empty. There was no unfinished wreckage, no piles of scrap wood, no chaotic construction. Filling the entire length of the cavernous hall stood the Golden Lion, fully completed, perfectly sealed, polished to a mirror-like sheen, and rigged with silk sails so breathtakingly exquisite that they looked as though they had been woven by angels rather than carpenters. Not a single hammer blow had been heard for half a year, yet the most magnificent vessel in the Mediterranean stood ready to launch. The chief magistrate stumbled forward, falling to his knees before Master Nickel, who sat quietly on a wooden stool near the stern, calmly carving a small wooden duck with a tiny penknife. "Master Nickel, avact," the magistrate whispered, his voice trembling with awe. "How is this possible? For 6 months not a sound has issued from these walls. We believed you were idle. We believed you had failed. How could a ship of this magnitude build itself in absolute silence?" Nickel did not stop carving. He blew a light shaving of wood from his blade, looked up with clear, serene eyes, and smiled. "You judge creation by the noise of the carpenter, Your Excellency," Nickel said softly. You believe that a thing is only being made when hammers are swinging, saws are screaming, and men are sweating in panic. That is the way of the frantic apprentice who does not know what he is doing. Nickel gestured toward the gleaming hull of the warship. When you signed the contract 6 months ago, the shipwright continued, the design was already complete in my mind. The true work of building a ship is not the physical nailing of oak planks. It is the mental conception of the vessel in its absolute perfection. Once the blueprint was locked in consciousness, the physical wood did not need to be bullied. It simply surrendered to the design. Every day you stood outside shouting for progress. Nickel chuckled quietly. I sat here in the silence, resting in the absolute reality of the finished ship. The universe took my assumption, gathered the finest timber from the northern forests across the sea, aligned the master carvers in secret, and assembled every bolt and beam in the dark womb of this dry dock without requiring a single drop of your panic or your sweat. The magistrate bowed his head, touching his forehead to the stone floor. We demanded noise when we should have trusted the master. Yes, Nickel whispered, turning back to his carving. Creation is always silent in the womb. Only destruction makes a noise. The parable of the Venetian shipwright is not a historical anecdote. It is the exact, unalterable mirror of your own spiritual maturity. You have spent your life demanding noise from the universe. When you plant a seed of desire, you expect immediate fireworks, daily proof, and constant sensory validation, panicking the moment the Sabbath descends and the visible world goes silent. You have confused the quiet gestation of the womb with the death of your dreams. It is time to bolt the doors of the dry dock. This does not mean descending into passive indifference or abandoning your life. True mastery of the Sabbath is the supreme, unshakable trust in the invisible architecture of creation. It is the profound realization that the silence of the Sabbath is not evidence of absence, but the absolute proof that the infinite intelligence is working behind the veil to construct your desire with a perfection your conscious mind could never engineer. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the absolute stillness at the center of your being. Recognize that the silence in your life right now, the waiting, the apparent stillness, the invisible interval between planting and harvesting is the most sacred part of your journey. You are not required to hammer the planks. You are not required to scream at the gates. You are simply required to rest in the absolute certainty that the vessel is already finished in consciousness, and that in its own perfect, unalterable hour, the heavy doors of the dry dock will swing open to reveal a masterpiece. Go now into the silence of your evening. Plant your desire in the only soil that matters, the soil of consciousness. Assume it. Feel it real. Surrender the how. Follow the ease. Honor the Sabbath, and rest in the absolute divine certainty that it is already done. The journey is complete, traveler. You are home.